Acha, somebody is calling. Nobody has joined. Okay. Hello. Hello, everybody. Good day to each one of you. Okay, actually, we joined Karachi Shonge Shonge, and there are lots of people who are joining now. Okay. So hope you're all fit and fine. We are meeting after a long hiatus. The pandemic and other personal issues had bogged us down, and we were unable to organize a webinar in the last few months. Very sorry for that. Though we have been active on our Facebook page, but we could not hold any webinar or adda that we had been doing since October 2020. Besides, we were transitioning from an online to an offline mode of teaching, and that taxed our energies considerably. Now that we are back, we hope to be more regular in organizing online events of this kind to engage with different aspects of women's history. Now, the theme of today's webinar is Birds Uncaged, Women and Travel. Women's travel has become a very significant field of feminist scholarship in recent times, and we are honored to have with us today three distinguished scholars who have worked extensively on women's travel in the context of colonial Bengal. Professor Jayati Gupta will be speaking on mobility as modernity, Bengali women and travel, 1880 to 1930. Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta will speak on marriage, migration and national identity, Hariprabha, Takeda in Japan. Dr. Parna Ghose is the chairperson of this session and also discussant today. Professor Jayati Gupta needs no formal introduction, but a few words about her academic achievements or academic contributions would be of great benefit to our students and young scholars. Professor Gupta was professor of English at the West Bengal State University, Barashat. She was awarded the prestigious Tagore National Fellowship for Cultural Research of the Ministry of Culture, Government of India in 2015-17. Her passion is researching and writing on travel literature, which she finds fascinating as it travels diverse cultures and ethnicities. She has worked on a project entitled The Cultures of Travel in Bengal at the National Library, Kolkata. Part of her research has been published in a book entitled Travel Culture, Travel Writing and Bengali Women, 1870 to 1940, in 2020 by Routledge, UK. Professor Gupta has published a large number of academic articles in national and international refereed journals. Her article, Many Journeys, Many Selves, The Travels of Margaret, please mute Karo, please. Yes, her article, Many Journeys, Many Selves, The Travels of Margaret Elizabeth Noble, was published by Taylor and Francis, UK, in Studies in Travel Writing, Volume 20, Issue 2, May 2016. Her book publications include Reading Poems, Narrative and Narration, an annotated edition of Moll Flanders, and many others. She also translates from Bangla. A Bengali travelogue edited by her was published by Jadavpur University School of Women's Studies and Days Publishing in 2005. Professor Gupta has also contributed to the Dictionary of National Biography, Oxford, in 2012. She is visiting faculty at Adamas University, Barashat. I now request Dr. Bhashwati Chatterjee to introduce Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta and Dr. Parna Ghose to the audience. Over to Bhashwati.
Thank you, Aparna. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta and Dr. Parna Ghose. Sanjukta Di being our senior at Presidency College, and she is very dear to us, very own Sanjukta Di. We are privileged to have you today in our webinar. Professor Dr. Sanjukta Dasgupta is an Associate Professor of Modern and Contemporary Indian History at the Department of Oriental Studies, Sapienza University of Rome, with a national qualification to serve a full professor. She had earlier worked as an Associate Professor in the Department of History, University of Calcutta, as an ICCR India Chair Professor at Sapienza University of Rome. She has been a visiting professor to Adam Mickiewicz University, Poland, Uppsala University, Sweden, University of Vienna, Austria, University Paris, of Detroit, France, KU Leuven, Belgium, Mikhalos Romaris Universities, Lithuania, and Jawaharlal Nehru University, India. She was educated at Presidency College, as I have already told you, Kolkata, and at the University of Calcutta, where she received her PhD in history for her research on Ho Adivasis in colonial India. Her current research interests include the histories of representation of marginalized communities of South Asia and migration and identity formation among the South Asian diaspora. Her publications focus on agrarian and environmental history, the social history of marginalized communities, women and emerging identities in colonial and contemporary South Asia. She is the author of Adivasis and the Raj, Socio-Economic Transition of the Hos, 1820 to 1932, and sorry, I can't spell it, I can't pronounce it, Sistema Institutional. Can Sanjukta, they do it for me because it's in Italian.
It's just a political, it's a very simple book actually.
Okay.
It's a reader on Indian constitution,
Okay,
on constitution, Sistema Istituzionale. I've forgotten the name of the book actually, but it's on a book on the Indian Constitution.
And, right. And has co-edited In Quest of the Historian's Craft, essays in honor of Professor B.B. Choudhury, a much acclaimed book. We all know of it. And Decentering Dominance Narratives in India, 2018, and many more. I shall not take it longer to say all her books, sorry. So it's our privilege, and we welcome Sanjukta Di to our webinar. Next, I want to introduce Professor Parna Ghose. She will be the chairperson and discussant of today's evening's webinar. Dr. Parna Ghose is Associate Professor in English and the Academic Coordinator of the Postgraduate Section of Department of English, Lady Brabourne College. She is also the convener of the Women's Studies Center of the college. Besides publishing in books and journals, she has edited 2 books, Women's Voices, Visions and Perspectives, published by the Women's Studies Center, and Indian English Literature, New Landscapes, published by the Advanced Research Center for Indian Writing in English of the Postgraduate Section, Department of English, Lady Brabourne College. She has also co-edited the volume Revisioning Sister Nivedita, published by the IQAC, the Women's Studies Center, and the Department of History, LBC. She is also the chief editor of the English section of newsletter, the Journal of Women's Studies Center of the college. Thank you, Parna Di, for being with us today. We welcome you heartily, and this is the floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Please take.
Thank you. So let us not waste any more time, but let us go straight to our first speaker, to Professor Jayati Gupta. Jayati Di, could you please, we are all actually eagerly waiting to hear you. So could you please begin?
First, let me thank the Women's History Conclave having invited me. And 2 things which I want to say in the very beginning. One is that I'm not a history person, okay? So I'm a literature person. So that is number one. And number two is that this is work in progress. So it's not a paper that I'm going to present, but, basically it's a conversation and a talk. And obviously, I would invite, questions if allowed. And I would like to, further go on with this work that I'm doing. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on Bengali women's travel, a very little portion of it. And more particularly in colonial India during the last 2 decades of the 19th and the first 3 of the 20th, roughly a time frame of, 50 years. But I'm leaving out certain things from there. When I talk of mobility, I'm going to talk only of the railways and the development of the railways. I'm not taking, women's travel, of those who have gone abroad, England and Norway and, places like that, Japan, because that is an area that I have covered, partly covered in my book. And I come to this term modernity that I have wanted to use over here in the title of my talk, which is likely to be controversial, this idea of modernity. Now, obviously, modernity has been defined and redefined over temporal contexts and geographical locales. For example, the Renaissance period in England is now called the early modern age. And this change in nomenclature implies a shift in approach and essence, very obviously. And so it's a conceptual shift that one talks about. But the Bengal, Renaissance, maybe, we take it from the 1800s to the 1940s. There have been various discussions on that. One is whether we should or could compare it to the awakening brought about in Italy and in Europe. Here it was, believed, or it was thought that it was brought about by British rule and Western culture. Or, can it be categorized as this Bengal Renaissance that we are talking about could be categorized as a socio-cultural process that could be called modernization, revitalization, or even an awareness or awakening. Another question which has been asked is, can the term Renaissance with a small r be equated with a modern consciousness or be used in other temporal contexts liberated from its European culture-specific connotations? So this is, what I will do to, attempt to do. I will try to talk of the gendered context of mobility or travel in the socio-temporal space of colonial India that was fast changing with urbanization, industrialization, and technology. We do come across the neologism, colonial modernity, a term in historiography that came into existence pretty late 1990s, that was largely shaped as an alternative to what was defined as being progressive in Western European, or more specifically British society. So these were people who were reinventing their given historical conditions, creating a material and intellectually viable modernization in India. So while modernity is generally associated with individual subjectivity, rationalization, empirical worldviews, it also supposedly marks the rise of nation states and accelerated forms of communication and economic growth. Then we're going to see which of these apply to the area of travel that we are going to talk about. One way of looking at modernity in India is to understand it as a social and intellectual project, rather than being a Eurocentric civilizing mission that supplanted antiquated forms of knowledge by newer models. So modernity in India is manifested itself in alternative cultural forms that have been brought into the purview of the cognitive sciences by Sanjukta Dasgupta, whose book, The Bengal Renaissance, Identity and Creativity, is one of the texts, one of the reference texts which I have been using. And he says over there that the way, I'm quoting, the way a person thinks about his work, the way he perceives nature, humanity, and culture, the way he draws upon his worldview, his knowledge, and his memory, including autobiographical memory, which is very relevant to our travelogues, the way he responds aesthetically and emotionally to related works of the past and the present, the reasoning he employs, the symbols and metaphors he invents and deploys, his drives and needs, these are the very ingredients that constitute the creative mind. Now, obviously, he is talking of an entirely different set of people. He's talking from of Ram Mohan to Rabindranath. He's talking of Jagadish Chandra Bose. He's talking of the growth of science. So it's in a entirely different context. But what I have borrowed from there, or what I have found interesting and applicable in this case, is this idea of what is cognition. So the first part of my lecture, I'm going to talk about these aspects and how very briefly and how it applies or will apply, or I hope will apply to the reading of the travelogues. And the second section, I'm going to talk about education, society, and rail travel, basically going to the debates about travel by women and rail travel by women, which were published in the journals of the time, the Bangla journals of the time, especially Bama Bodhini Potrika, from where I've taken several of these issues. And in the last part, I'm going to talk about writing, women's writing, and what was coming across as new. And all of it, all these travels are within India. So the parameters of time that I have chosen, 1880s to 1930s, specifically chosen in the context of a context that a woman's travel, woman's education rather, woman's travel marks the coming of age of the first generation of women who had the privilege of being educated formally or informally through the schools and colleges. Early travel, early women who were writing were informally educated. But after 1849, you have formal education for women. It further marks the entry of women into the public sphere during the various phases of the nationalist movement, especially from the 1920s onwards. In Bengal, we are witnessing upper and middle class women undergoing a transformation in the way in which they think, perceive, reason, and conceptualize, which constitutes their modernity. When women in Bengal cross the threshold to emerge out of the Antapur and remove their porda or veil, ghomta in Bengal, they were self-conscious about forging a new identity for themselves as the Bongo Nari, Bongo Mohila, or Bongo Ramani. And I'm talking here, the few examples that I have taken, very few of them, but the few examples that I have taken are all secular travel. So I'm not going to talk about pilgrimage travel or pilgrimages, which is an entirely different set of travelers. So when the term identity is used, we necessarily think of Freud and William James. But you also have the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, who describes identity formation as a simultaneous, essentially dual process situated within the individual and in the community of which she is a part. So identity becomes something which is psychosocial, a psychosocial entity. And this points to a personal continuity of experience and a sense of coherence with one's community or group. And that is why there is a feeling amongst these women travelers, there is a feeling of solidarity with the woman in the Ontopu, the women who have been left behind. In the travelogues where the women are traveling out to the west, that happens. It also happens in these, short kind of journal articles which they are publishing. So there is this feeling of the community or the group, and it's not as though these women travelers are, completely striking out on their own, trying to radically differ from the community of sisters or community of women to whom they belong or to which they belong. So it is precisely this that defines, I think, the modernity of Bengali woman, Indian woman, Bengali woman, as against the trajectory of feminism in the West. So it's not a kind of a radical, revolutionary breakaway, as it were, from the societal pattern or the community or the group. Now, most have read Krishna Bhabini's England Ebongo Mohila, and you will find that the traveling subject is racked by dilemmas and doubts as she discards her porda to travel out. And in my book I'm not reading out from the book, but in my book on page 27 to 28, I've talked about this. So there is this ambivalence that she feels. She was the only one to have adopted Western clothes. And she herself is thinking about her, the way in which she wants to or is projecting herself. So there is, I think, in this case, a kind of cognitive revolution that is expressed in terms of a transgressive acts, not just coming out of the Ontopu, not just, donning the hat and taking off a veil and, donning clothes, Western clothes, dress, but writing her troubles. So this idea of a cognitive identity forms the conceptual framework for understanding how mobility, both physical and metaphorical, affected the Bengali woman's psyche. I found the passage in Prashunnamoy Chaudhury's travelogue, Arjaborto, about knowledge and perception very modernist. I would, like to quickly remind you of that passage. And it says, everyone does not have the same descriptive powers. Similarly, everyone does not have similar powers of observation. Someone may roam the entire world and see nothing of interest except earth and bricks. Another person may visit only one country, a single town or village, and discover extensive data about human manners and behavior, etc. Sharpness of observation, she goes on to say, is concomitantly linked to how much knowledge a person commands. So, drawing attention to the word knowledge. Therefore, I'm not quite sure that I have been exceptionally perceptive, nor that I have been able to adequately represent what I have seen. But a man may perceive things in a particular way, which may not be exactly how it appears in the eyes of a woman. Hence, some may want to know how the different sides of this historically glorious Aryavarta are reflected through the eyes and emotions of a Bengali woman. Eyes and emotions. So, this emotional quotient, which is part of this modernity. So, at one level, she's talking of the knowledge space she has acquired through her social, cultural, ethnic background, which she shared with her family, community, and country. At another, she is referring to knowledge that comes from literature, music, arts, philosophy, from which she has drawn her values and beliefs. And at another level, her belief and knowledge space is entirely private. Opinions and perceptions about the world beyond herself are something which she accumulates through her gaze. So the belief or knowledge space is not fixed, but evolves and is revised by the way new objects, even in a single person, new objects, entities, ideas, beliefs enter that space. One of the ways this happens, of course, is through movement and mobility that is synonymous with travel. People travel, minds travel, cultures travel all the time. And the shifts or changes in the knowledge space acquire their own pace and impact. Sometimes epiphanic, a kind of eureka moment. Sometimes it is quiet and a muted transformation. So with that preliminary explanation of how I'm looking at modernity, how I'm looking at the knowledge space, I would like to, just bring in education, society, and rail travel. And how was education related to rail travel and the perceptions of society? Now, as early as 1818, Raja Ram Mohan Rai, during his declarations on the Hindu practice of sati, published in an English version of his ideas entitled A Conference Between an Advocate for and an Opponent of the Practice of Burning Widows Alive, he has talked about how, biologically, women are in general considered to be inferior to men on bodily strength and energy, and consequently, the male part of the community, I'm paraphrasing from there, male part of the community, taking advantage of that weakness, have denied them, and I quote now, those excellent merits that they are entitled to by nature. So somewhere the woman or the education of women was suppressed, kept in the background. And obviously he says that how can you judge a woman or the inferiority of a woman's mind if the opportunity for education has not been given? So as you keep women generally void of education and acquirements, you cannot therefore in justice pronounce on their inferiority. So, that is, how woman or woman's education was initially looked at. And in Bengal, the idea of a separate education for men and for women, that was promoted up to, say, the 1920s and 30s. So there were many debates raging during that time on women's education. Now, modernity, as understood in the context of Bengali women, is actually about their own desire to be uncaged, an awareness of a sphere outside domesticity, and a distinct need to experience one's subjectivity. So desire, awareness, need. So, these were growing within the woman's mind, woman's subjectivity. I recently listened to a talk by Professor Dipesh Chakraborty, where he was discussing Shivnath Shastri's Attochori, and where he talked about how Bengali modernity was located in this awareness of self. So the woman, whether educated or not, not fully educated at this point of time, but perhaps, they are being educated, and there is the sense of self which is growing. So talking about the rail travel, how are we doing for time? Okay, right. In the Ashin 1871 issue of Bamabodhini Putrika, in an article, Edeshio Bongo Mohilar Bohirbromon, the writer discusses how educated women confined in the Antapur are finding it increasingly intolerable. So the call is to review the situation with an unprejudiced mind and to do away with impediments, which is, and I quote, the objective and duty of every person looking after the welfare of women. And the writer expresses his admiration for womenfolk, of how, they maintain their energy, intelligence, religiosity within the Zanana itself or within the Antapur. And he talks about the serious efforts which are being made for opening up education to them, both secular and religious. And we know that in 1866, Mary Carpenter, came on this mission to educate women within the Antapura Zanana. So the writer here in this article is talking about how, and I quote, women confined in the Antapur are deprived of a lot of lovely sights of the world, and how their talents are not given the opportunity to prosper fully and come into contact with only one type, because they come into contact with only one type of people and materials. So there is no scope for self-development. But this article, the writer appends a letter by Janakinath Sarkar that expresses apprehensions about the indecency prevalent in Hindu society, the wantonness, the obscenity, the lustfulness to which respectable Hindu women would be exposed if they came out, if they traveled. And the danger of exposing women to the public sphere by allowing them to travel, that becomes the subject matter of, that letter which is put in over there. And 6 reasons are enumerated by Janakinath Sarkar to validate that fear. One, a woman, are not dressed properly. And here, of course, we know how Gyanodanandini Devi brought about, the sartorial reform. So I'm not going into that. The second thing, that Janakinath Sarkar says, that women are referred to in Hindu Shastras as abala. So they are weak and unprotected, and they can't go out without protection. The third thing that, he says is that the English are very mindful of their behavior towards women. And, so measures to safeguard the honor and modesty of Indian women, Bengali women, that is needed before they can at all be allowed to go up. The fourth thing that, he says is that women should themselves, behave in a more dignified manner so that this baseless fear is taken away from them, that, something can happen if they go out. So, and women should, and then it says, women should travel only to places where they can acquire knowledge or religion. So it was only sanctioning maybe pilgrimages, as that was where a woman usually went in early times. And lastly, the 6th reason, point that he mentions is that women should learn manners from more civilized and progressive nations. So there was this entire debate about, that women were not yet prepared to go out, to travel. And in the next issue, that is card 71, in an article, Bama Brabourne, or Travels of Women, the debate on whether women should travel outside is further taken up. And it says that the more women through acquiring knowledge will improve and acquire true freedom, the more prepared will they be for travel outside and will be able to increase their own good and that of society. Own good and that of society, So they have to prepare themselves through, proper education. And then the writer argues that women's travel is not always synonymous with mental improvement. And, mental improvement or becoming liberated. And he cites the example of uneducated, lower caste females, their minds caged in the darkness of ignorance, traveling to different places, but gaining nothing from it because they are not educated, their minds are not yet prepared. So he says, uneducated women are excited at the prospect of going out anywhere at all. So to consider travel as a way to improve the condition of women is dangerous. So that was it. And but it was recommended for a particular class of women whose minds are improved, broadened, purified by knowledge, and is equated with being truly civilized. So improving knowledge or through education, that was accepted as the ideal of culture among Hindu ladies. So it's only after the mind is prepared that one can travel. And travel for the good of society. That was another point which was making. And it was, I quote, to brighten the face of the country, to establish peace in every home. So a woman like that would be doing that. And this reminds me of a series of satirical sketches by Gaganendranath Thakur portraying Hindu women traveling out with men. And maybe, we can look at the first slide over there, if possible. And it shows this Bengali gentleman.
Yes.
Yeah.
Akash, are you here? Hello.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah. Let him come out with it. So it shows this Bengali gentleman.
Please start the presentation, please.
Yes, 1 second.
Yeah.
Just a minute here.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
I very small, I think, but it is this Bengali gentleman going out, his wife at the back with all the children, one in, she's carrying, and she's also carrying the luggage. So that is the satirical picture that we have. I'm going to juxtapose it against, some other pictures. Maybe if you have been able to download the next slide, or this one. Yeah, this one. Again, it's raining, it's pouring, it's raining, and you have this gentleman standing over there, and this his wife standing there with the child, somehow trying to, and this is on a railway platform, right? So, so women's travel was seen by men in this kind of fashion. And before I go on to the other two slides, I would mention that in 1873, Posh, that issue of Bama Bodhini, in the section on women's writing, a lady writes about the benefits of travel, or Porjoton. The two outcomes are happiness and utility, upokar. So one is an emotional feeling of the subject who is traveling, and the other is the social benefit, the utility to others within the house and for the nation that is being talked about. And I would like to argue that the men set their minds on how useful women would be in their public life and in the household if they traveled. And here the woman refers to the intangible benefits of travel herself. She talks about happiness. She talks about the broadening of the mind, the awareness of beauty and the variety of the natural world that generates feelings of religiosity, curiosity, contentment, of discovering newness, direct experiential knowledge of places and peoples, and most importantly, a communion with God. But this is still, not a pilgrimage that she's talking about. So the women talk of an inner transformation, a cognitive change, an emotional impact, often a spiritual transformation, which is different from the progressive act of physical travel itself. Obviously, physical travel was facilitated by technology. It was engineered by science, instituted or institutionalized, I would say, by elaborate colonial and administrative machinery. Technological advancement in India was enmeshed in society and became an integral part of the social order. It was a process of industrialization and progress playing itself out since the institution of the railways in the 1850s. So the railways in India, though it was built, for the economic and military control over colonial possession, one way where it did not fulfill the intended consequences, let us put it that way, unintended, it became unintended, is the idea of the nation which comes about. But the other thing which was also happening is that it provided, while it provided a platform, let us put it that way, for modern nationalism, it also created a new middle class of professionals and merchants. And the impact of the railways in India can offer, I would say, a conceptual framework to situate technologies within the integrated material, moral, and social landscapes. So one can say that the railways transformed the way in which the country was imagined, the way in which values were determined, especially class and caste. And the social order was transformed. And also, women traveling, it had this larger kind of an impact. Let me go to two railway advertisements of the 1930s, about 1938-39. Can we have the next two slides, please? It's Eastern Bengal Railway. And look at this. So we had the satirical presentation, and here we are looking at the railways promoting themselves, all right? But the colonial railway promoting itself in a very, very, unique or different way. Pujo Brabourne and the Eastern Bengal Railway. Look at that gentleman. He is also, carrying, he's not the babu in that sense of the term. He's carrying the bags. There is this little girl, but the lady and the little girl, they are barefooted. And you can see the kash over there and the train coming in. I think that is Dokhineshwar at the back. And they are running to get to the train, or they're trying to get to the train. Let's look at the second, advertisement again from the railways, the Eastern Bengal Railway. Look at the change that, seems to be manifest over here. This lady is wearing shoes. There is a coolie carrying their baggage. There is this gentleman and the lady moving side by side. There is this little boy, over there. The lady is not carrying any baggage like in the previous, the satire and the previous, advertisement which we looked at. So that's all I think. These are the only 4 pictures that I wanted to show. So through the 19th century, in the pattern of railway development, the comfort and safety of women passengers was addressed in various ways. In Bamabodhuni of Ogrohayon, 1869, the news about a special carriage for women that was advertised. We hear of ladies' compartments, ladies' guards, female helpers, so what we can understand that women were traveling more frequently, number one, and number two, the colonial government was trying to, encourage that. I don't know whether encourage or I don't know what, but there was this idea that women could travel. So they were looking at the public debates and they were saying that the woman could travel safely. And in 1888, again in an issue of Bamabodhini, there's a Bengali translation of the relevant laws on rail travel, which are enumerated over there. And I will end this section with Muslim women's travel. Rokeya Sakawat Hussain in Oborod Bashini, section 16, narrates an incident that draws attention to the condition of travel endured by Muslim women. She says, a wealthy gentleman from Bihar Sharif was traveling to Darjeeling. He had a sizable human luggage comprising his maternal and paternal aunts, adding up to 7 women, 5 girls ranging from ages 6 to 13. Wherever they had to change trains or steamers, arrangements had to be made for palkis. There were palkis in Monihari Ghat and Shokrigoli Ghat. The BBs were loaded onto the palkis that was then placed in the steamer deck. When boarding a train, the palki in which they were ensconced was placed in the luggage van. Unfortunately, along the Eastern Bengal Railway line, no palki was available. So they were compelled to sit in the second-class railway compartment that had been reserved. And then what happens in Chiliguri station? There was no palki that was available. And this was a major crisis. How were the BBs going to go onto the train to Darjeeling, board the train? 2 sheets were held on either side by 4 persons, and the BBs walked down, curtained off like this. The unfortunate servants holding up the sheets were unable to keep their balance as they walked on the uneven hilly tracks. Sometimes the curtain to the right marched ahead, the one on the left lagged behind. Again, occasionally, the left curtain advanced and the right curtain trailed at the back. So, it's a humorous situation which is made out of it, but it also, talks about the travails of travel if you are going to strictly follow the Padda. In the last part of my talk, I will like to touch upon the writings by women, the creativity that is generated by the experience of what Swarnaprabha Bosu in Bongo Mohilar Himalaya Brahman refers to as, and I quote, forgetting the burdens of home and responsibilities, the upliftment of the heart and spirit, a mood, she says, that she wants to keep intact on her return. So travel is not just about going, it's also about coming back. It is coming back with a particular kind of change in the cognitive and emotional faculties. In Antapur, 1902, the journal, the writer, using the pseudonym Probashini in Kashmir Pothe, begins with a feeling of claustrophobia, sitting in the railway compartment. Then, looking out of the window, she lets her imagination wander. entering even into the secluded quarters of the women in the villages she saw in the distance, recreating feelings of love, affection that she had left behind. In this travelogue, there are several instances of the use of internal memories. If her travel in Kashmir has been like a sojourn through heaven, she talks of the homecoming and the fearless way in which she can recollect those memories, a kind of internalization rare in male travelogues. Very significantly, the mobility of traveling elsewhere is associated with an emotion space or emotional space. For men, it is more the knowledge space. That is a personal space of emotional sensibilities, the capacity to experience or feel a certain repertoire of emotions. And that is the modernity that I'm talking about. Most of these women travelers began by describing a sense of desire, the want to move out of the constrictions of domesticity and the familiar. December 1901, in Kashmir Chitra, the author writes, "I am a Bengali woman caged in the home. I had a strong desire since my childhood to travel. I was eager to enjoy the freedom and beauty of nature. For someone like this, living in the palace city of Kolkata, duty-bound, the days slipped by, but the mental happiness and health both ebbed away." So again, here I'm talking of, these words that she is using. I've translated them, but the words that she's using, the desire, the sense of being deprived. And then she talks about depression. These are all mental states, or what Freud would call drives, out of which I think creativity is generated. So, it's these feelings of woman, the emotions of woman, which go into the writing of the travelogues, which is a new genre. Emotions are generated from perceptions of the outer world, social and cultural interactions. These emotions may have their roots in the knowledge space or personal space, which through communication with the outer sphere arouses certain sensibilities as part of the consciousness. I'm coming to Rokea's own writing, 1904, of a rail journey to Darjeeling. I'm not taking the first part where she describes that rail journey. And then towards the end, she says, each and every high mountain peak, each and every waterfall seems to say at first, "Look at me, look at me." Then when I look at them with wonder-widened eyes, it seems that they frown a little and with half a smile ask, "What are you looking at me for? Salute the divine creator." Absolutely right. A painting reveals the qualities of an accomplished painter. Otherwise, who would recognize another just on the strength of the name? For us, even the foothills of the Himalayas are such a vast expanse, so spectacular. And the Himalayas are a speck in that vast canvas of the world created by the divine artist. One can even compare it to a grain of sand. And then she says, we have these beautiful visual, auditory, and reflective faculties. And with these, if we do not sing pains to the Almighty, are we any less grateful to him? When one prays with one's mind, head, and heart in harmony, then there is satisfaction. Parroting a few memorized verses is not a prayer. So the emotions that she feels through the travel, this is secular travel that we are talking about, the emotions that she feels of ecstasy, euphoria, the spiritual experience, and transformation, these are part of the emotional processes which aid the cognition. So she draws on a visual, auditory, reflective faculties that are the talents of woman, and even, the talents when I come back to what I began with, where Ram Mohan talks about how the talents are not given opportunity to flower. And here we have with travel, that is what is happening. Now, most of the women's travelogues begin with a self-deprecatory announcement. For example, Kamini Rai, well known, 1886, again in Darjeeling, Brabourne. She says, the eyes and heart are not trained enough to perceive and realize the indescribable beauty of God's universe. So, there is this feeling of lack. There is this feeling almost of abjection that many of these women feel. I come to the conclusion, what I've drawn from this. My contention is that technological mobility encouraged women to travel and allowed their creativity to find expression in travel writing that we see proliferating in the late 19th century Bengal. It was not just the printing presses and locomotives that were the tools, the visible objects of modernization that led to the creative upsurge. It was not just the social reform movements and progress through education, the other markers of modernization that constituted the modernity of these women. It was more an awareness within that generated a sense of identity and an inner compulsion to write. What we see in the travelogues is not just the location or site of travel replicated, but the trajectory of women's cognitive growth and awareness of emotional sensibilities that unleashed their creativity. So that is how I want to see modernity, travel, and Bengali women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jayati. We have all been enriched by this talk of yours. I would be taking questions on this, but I myself, being a little selfish over here, would like to ask you or maybe comment upon one or two things. And you mentioned the Bamabodhini Potrika, for example, and people like Janakinath Sarkar talking about the necessity of how women dress, or and kind of coming to the conclusion that women were not really still prepared to undertake travel. And moreover, whatever women did, particularly in terms of travel, it was all about for their own good vis-a-vis their domesticity, and of course the society, that society would benefit from that. One point I would like to make over here is that, women were, of course, transgressing when they were traveling. That was a male domain. And of course, by writing too, that was kind of unthinkable that women were writing. First of all, we see that most of these women, would you agree, Jayati, that most of these women were women who came from the enlightened families, and they therefore had an advantage over the others. And a second point I want to make is, here we have Bamabodhini Potrika, we have Bharati and other magazines or periodicals of Bengali print media, that is. I know you said that you wouldn't be touching upon any one who went abroad, but just in relation to the travelers that you mentioned, and particularly women travelers in general, I do recall a line coming out in the Punch of June 1893, a lady, an explorer, a traveler in skirts. The notion is
Yes.
just a trifle too seraphic. Let them stay and mind the babies or hem our ragged shirts. But they mustn't, can't, and shan't be geographic. So
Yes.
be it the East or the West, I mean, the situation was more or less the same. So what would you say there?
I would say that, the woman who, the European woman or the British woman who did, strike out on their own, they were actually trying to become explorers, and, they were completely, completely breaking away from their social background or ethos, and they were trying to prove themselves, a kind of form of feminism, you can say.
Right.
But in the case of the Bengali woman or Indian woman generally, I would say that it was, they were not going against, they didn't want to go against society. They were still very much part of the community and the group while they did, go out. And so, there's a major kind of difference in the idea of modernity that we are looking at in this context, or, in the context of Bengali woman. So, that is what, I have been feeling, and that is what I was trying to bring out.
Yes, in fact, as far as our Bengali women are concerned, I'm not sure, I don't have that extensive knowledge whether we can say our Indian women in general, but the fact is that they were kind of allowed by their menfolk to cross the Lakshman Rekha. I mean, and as you said, there is that self-deprecatory note in most of their writings, and they kind of inevitably, Krishna Bhavini, for example, she does mention at the very beginning that her husband has gone through her manuscript thoroughly and suggested whatever changes are necessary. So that male approval was required, whether it be in terms of writing or stepping or crossing the threshold. Yes.
There, Parna, I would say yes, very obviously that. But in these, these short article travelogues that I've been reading recently, I feel that the women are freer to express their emotions and their feelings. They seem to be a little freer. I don't know, but maybe they were not censored in that sense so closely by the menfolk or the editors or whatever.
So there has been a progress. Sorry, Jayati, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no. Yes, there's been a progress. And, I'm always, amazed by the, railway advertisements, because, I just showed you two, which, figured this, family. And, but there are an entire lot, of course, which show the other part of railway travel, which is, the nationalism part of it. But, these two, I find it very distinctive. And the rural and the urban, the so-called elite and the rural, both, going to that. And so railway travel was a great equalizer. So that.
Right. So I will take more questions over here. There has been a number of questions in the chat box. Apodrajita Hazra wants to know, okay, she says that was stupendously enriching, Jayati.
And if I'm allowed to interrupt, I do want to, say something. This is not a question, because Jayati is such a, storehouse of knowledge that it is not in my position to question anything. But I was just wondering, it crossed my mind when she was talking about how the travel of women was more on the epistemological basis or for the societal good. I was thinking what Jacques Lacan would say to this, because it sounded so much like whether the travelogues which record the rather suppression of what Lacan would call jouissance. So not just in the desire to travel, not just in the desire, but in the act of desiring itself, as if that is something hush-hush, that is something not to be done. So desire to traverse beyond the symbolic signifiers of a man's world, which we understand that it was primarily a man's world at the time. So travel probably was a kind of objet petit to the women of that age, because the
the striving towards the satisfaction of the Zuisa, then failing in that, and then the circuit begins again. And so the objectivity goes on and on and on like a black hole. Was it like that, Jayati? It was so interesting.
Partly, maybe, I'm now, trying to look into, what went on in the minds of the woman when they wanted to travel. And all of them, talk about how from my childhood I had this desire to travel and, that kind of a thing. And the other one is about, being uncaged. So one is liberation and one is this, desire. It, constantly, these tropes or these, ideas keep coming back in, most of the travelogues that I have been looking at. Yes, Aparajita, yours is an interesting observation. I will, perhaps look into it closer.
Thank you. Jyoti, just one small thing. You showed us 2 railway ads. Could I just get the dates of those ads? Because I was taking notes.
Both. If I took these from the Center for Studies in Social Sciences, and I copied on my the digital thing a lot of these. So both I think belong to the year 1939.
1939.
But, whether it's just that they have put in that date out of conjecture, because I do find a large difference between the first one which I showed of this rural this thing, and the other one which I showed of this lady in her shoes and
her hair was also quite
so that so it says 1939.
Okay. I note that down. Thank you, Jyoti. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Next, Professor Zarina Alam says, it has been an enlightening talk. Thank you for opening up a new dimension, emotions and creativity in women's travel writing. That's more of a comment. And of course, it has been enriching, immensely enriching, as I have already mentioned. Kothika Ray has a question, in fact, which I was also about to ask you. She says, Madam, I want to know, what is the role played by Bengali Muslim women in this process of travel writing, except Begum Ruqayya? My question too was this: was there anyone else?
I have been trying to look for someone else, but I haven't got to it. Begum Ruqayya's, these Oborod Bashini and, these travelers, short little travelogues, which I've got from that Rachana Buli. That is what I've got. There is this book which was brought out by Stree at that point of time, Zenana Zanana, this thing, but it doesn't really have any travel bit over there. So I have to look at it more closely. I have been trying for it, but it's very, very difficult to get to it. I don't know whether the woman would, even from Bengal, would have written in Urdu or Arabic or Persian. I don't know. Early times they may have written in Persian, to which I don't have access. I have been asking around, but I don't have access.
Okay. And anyone else with any other question?
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
My name is this is a little bit personal question. My question is about travel from the late 1920s or early 30s in the context of the freedom movement. My own grandmother was a freedom fighter. She grew up in Faridpur and then she traveled to Kolkata and then did her bachelor's there and participated in the Anushil and Shomiti. So at that time, there were a lot of solo women activists who were inspired, some of them by Netaji Subhash Bose and other. So, even trade union leaders. So a lot of women were coming into the fold of the freedom movement, and they had, I would imagine they had to travel, some of them even probably underground, under surveillance. So could you address that, how they did that kind of solo travel? Was it unusual? And did that happen all of a sudden, or was there a transition?
I haven't come across, or I haven't, also yet looked for travelogues that they may have written. They could have written, autobiographical pieces, perhaps not as travelogues, and nationalistic issues which were foremost in their mind. They would have, talked about that. And yes, they would have traveled, but they would have traveled, I think, in small groups, perhaps. I'm not quite sure that they would have traveled completely alone. So it was the group identity or the community identity from which or through which I think they would have drawn their support and their emotional sustenance as such. Directly, I have not, seen any of these as travelogues, and whether they could be autobiographical. If it is autobiographical and still it describes a journey, then, it will fall within a travelogue. But if it doesn't, if it's just talking about nationalism, and we know, or there is this mention of having traveled from one place to another, then it it will not fall into the purview of a traveler. Do you have, since you talked about your grandmother, do you have any journals or letters or series of letters that she would have written or she would have had in your personal collections?
I spoke to her when I was a child, and she had some articles in the Onushilan Barta. They did not specifically address travel, but it was more her, Marxist kind of movement, political writings, but not, yes, specifically to do with travel.
Yes, political writings, yes. Thank you.
Parnadi, can I ask a question?
Oh, yes, surely.
No, I think there are more questions in the chat box.
Yes.
You finish them first.
Yes, please. I'll just read that out. This is from Uttam Maikup. Thank you, ma'am. Just an amazing discussion. Just a query. Is there any, I think you mean leisurely purpose in their traveling desire? Is there any purpose of leisure? Is that you mean?
See, leisure and these are not pilgrimages. That is one thing. But I think the concept of leisure in the true sense of the term hadn't yet, come in that way around this time, or at least the woman carried their own responsibilities, part of it, though they were going out, they liberated, etc. But still, they carried some of their responsibilities along, as you can see from that satirical sketch as well. So the leisure part of it, I think, will come a little later. It was still here. The desire to travel was, yes, the desire to know on the one hand, and the desire to shape, for those who were going abroad, to shape Indian society to a certain extent. So it was, all of this. Leisure in the pure terms of leisure, that I'm not quite sure that, we will, or we can talk of that idea. I have to look into it, but I don't know, whether we can say that it's leisure. And those, I haven't taken any of those, but, they were also going, because Aryabhatta is about that. They are going to historical places, Chittor, Munger, and places like that. And so, that historical imagination is coming to light. So it was part of that process of educating oneself. It was part of the reactions were emotional, but it was part of that cognitive process of acquiring knowledge. Yeah. Yes, Apurna, you were wanting to ask.
Yes. Thank you, Jayati, for an immensely enriching lecture. Jayati, I was intrigued by your reference to a few articles in the Mama Bodhini Potrika, where the writer was expressing his anxiety about women traveling on the railways. Actually, I have found, and I think many others have found, plenty of instances of women suffering sexual harassment on the railways. Okay, so have any of the women who have written about the travel experiences, written about the travel experiences, alluded to any kind of encounter with sexual harassment on the railway?
Not that I have, seen any of that, and they wouldn't come out. I'm quite sure that they wouldn't write or they wouldn't come out, and not especially. It could be a personal diary which would be thrown away then by the family, but it would never come out in any of the contemporary journals. That is number one. But because of this idea of sexual harassment, etc., that is why the East India Railways, etc., they went into this idea of, and that railway ain, that thing also brings this out, that the women's compartments. And in the Rokia, in that article, from that article which I just read, she or that piece that I just read, in the beginning she talks about how in the stations there would be these exclusively women's this retiring rooms, and how the staff over there in Darjeeling, it was Bhutia girls who were employed, Bhutia women who were employed. So obviously there was a social awareness about this, and but none of the women have really written about it. Not that I have got hold of.
Okay.
Can I ask?
Monikuntala, yes, please. আমি জাস্ট একটা কথাই বলছিলাম যে মণিকুন্তলা সেন সেদিনের কথায় ওই রাস্তায় ট্রাভেল করার সময় মানে ওই হ্যারাসমেন্টের উল্লেখ করেছেন, মানে somebody just murmuring something মানে on her ears, এবং সেটা মানে উনি বলছেন বীর সিনড্রোম। হ্যাঁ, তো মানে যেগুলো এখন হয়, এবং মানে she encountered it every day on her way to Calcutta University. She would be staying at a hostel on Harrison Road, and she would be crossing that big park in front of Calcutta University, which is a gold digging at Kibol, and then Calcutta University jeten. So every day there would be an old man, a middle-aged man, who would be murmuring something into her ears. এবং তারপরে এছাড়া রাস্তায় এরকম হয়েছে যে বাসে করে যাচ্ছে somebody in a car মানে uttering something obscene. হ্যাঁ, just so these things did happen on the streets. That this did happen. এবং I think on the railways too there were lots of instances, because there is one among the audience, Dr. Urmita Rai. I remember she had written and she had presented a paper at Itihas Sangshad on the sexual harassment that women had faced in course of their rail travel. I think Urmita is here, if she can share some of her thoughts later. So did this happen? But it's very surprising that women would not open up. When they were writing about their travels, they would prefer to be silent about these unsavory experiences.
They wouldn't dare, I guess. Even today, yes, how many women really
even today, Apurna.
Apurna, yes, Urmita is speaking. Yes.
শোনা যাচ্ছে? আসলে অপর্ণা বলবো বলে আমার যেটা মনে পড়ছে যে আমি কিন্তু কিছু চিঠি পেয়েছি, খুব সামান্য আমার মনে পড়ছে, যেখানে ওই মহিলা নিজেই কিন্তু কমপ্লেন করছেন, উনি ওনার ছেলের বউকে নিয়ে যাচ্ছিলেন, এটা বোধহয় সোম প্রকাশে, ওনার ছেলের বউকে নিয়ে ট্রাভেল করছিলেন। তো সেখানে রিপিটেডলি একজন অ্যাংলো ইন্ডিয়ান ticket collector, সে ওনাকে মানে she was being subjected to harassment, I mean her daughter-in-law. তো একটা ওরকম, আর এর উপরে আমি অনেক পেয়েছি যে মহিলারাই লিখছেন তা না, ছেলেরা পুরুষরাই লিখেছেন, কিন্তু কিছু কিছু মহিলাদের উল্লেখ রয়েছে। এবং একটা তো অনেক মুহূর্তে মনে পড়ছে না যে এরকম হয়েছিল যে বাইরে থেকে ওয়েটিং রুমের দরজাটা ল্যাচ করে দেওয়া হয়েছিল, মানে তাকে ওই জানলা দিয়ে এসকেপ করতে হয়েছিল, এরকমও মানে বর্ণনা রয়েছে। আর তাছাড়া এই যে ব্যাপারটা, এটা নিয়ে সেই সময়কার মানে ইন্ডিয়ান ওপিনিয়ন, সেটা মানে তার মধ্যে আবার ন্যাশনালিস্টরাও কিছু ছিল, সেটা এতটাই স্ট্রং হয়ে গিয়েছিল যে সেখানে তখন ওই মানে অ্যাংলো ইন্ডিয়ানদের আর এমপ্লয়মেন্ট দেওয়া হবে কিনা সেই নিয়ে একটা বেশ বড় ধরনের বিতর্ক তৈরি হয়ে গিয়েছিল। এবং সেটাতে ন্যাশনালিস্টরাও খুব পার্টিসিপেট করেছিল যে অ্যাংলো ইন্ডিয়ানদের ক্যারেক্টার, মানে তারা যে ওই রকম তাদের মধ্যে একটা চরিত্র রয়েছে, তারা এটা করে থাকে, এইগুলো আমি দেখেছিলাম আর কি। এখন আমার একটু মনে পড়ছে, ডিটেলসটা মনে নেই। এই নিয়ে একটা ভাগ হয়ে গিয়েছিল যে চাকরির বাজারে যে একটা মানে শর্টেজ দেখা দিচ্ছে, যে চাকরি পাচ্ছে না এদের শিক্ষিত যুবকরা, এবং সেখানে অ্যাংলো ইন্ডিয়ানরা এই সমস্ত রেলওয়ে যে চাকরি মোটামুটি তারাই যে মানে বেশিরভাগটা তারা পেয়ে যাচ্ছে। তো সেইটা নিয়ে এই সময় যেটা দেখা যাচ্ছিল যে অ্যাংলো ইন্ডিয়ানদের মধ্যে গিয়ে দোষারোপ করা, তো এইভাবে যে ভাগটা হয়ে যাওয়া, এবং সেখানে মেয়েদের মানে নারীর শরীরকে ব্যবহার করা হচ্ছে, মেয়েদের কণ্ঠস্বর হয়তো সেই জায়গায় শোনা যাচ্ছে না। কিন্তু শুরুটা হচ্ছে এই বিতর্কের এই জায়গাটাকে কেন্দ্র করে, যে ওই মানে ট্রাভেলিং এর সময়, রেলওয়েজ ট্রাভেলিং এর সময় সেক্সুয়াল হ্যারাসমেন্ট, সেইটাকে নিয়েই বিতর্কটা শুরু হচ্ছে।
এবং ওই আলাদা কম্পার্টমেন্ট, আলাদা লেডি গার্ড ইত্যাদি এইসবের ব্যবস্থাটা 1869 থেকে হচ্ছে, যেখানে 1854-59 এর মধ্যে মানে জিনিসটা হয়েছে। সেইখানেতে মানে 1869 খুব তাড়াতাড়ি তার মানে জিনিসটা মানে যে হলো, সেটার কিন্তু মানে কারণটাই অবভিয়াসলি মানে এই জিনিসগুলো হচ্ছিল, যার জন্যে এটা। আর ওই যে গগনেন্দ্রনাথের যে সেটা আমি দেখাতে পারিনি, কিন্তু তোমরা দেখতে পাবে যে একটা আছে রেলওয়ে প্ল্যাটফর্মে এবং দুজন মহিলা তারা হেঁটে যাচ্ছে, এবং মানে ট্রেন থেকে এবং বাইরে, এটা স্যাটিরিক্যাল স্কেচ একটা, বাইরেতে একজন বাঙালি ভদ্রলোক আর একজন মুসলমান লোক, তারা সবাই মানে তাকে দেখছে। আমরা দেখছি মানে মহিলা দুটির পেছন দিকটা আর কি, তারা হেঁটে যাচ্ছে, শাড়ি পরা, ঘোমটা দেওয়া, তারা যাচ্ছে। আর ট্রেনটা দাঁড়িয়ে আছে বাঁ দিকেতে, সবাই সেখান থেকে মানে তাকিয়ে দেখছি, সব পুরুষ মানুষ। সেই জন্য এই যে
মাসিক বসুমতীতে এই ছবিটা বেরিয়েছিল। হ্যাঁ, একটা প্রশ্ন একটু করতে চাইছিলাম অনেকক্ষণ ধরেই, যদি সুযোগ পাই।
আচ্ছা, এই প্রসঙ্গে একটা কথা কি বলতে পারি, একটু অ্যাড করতে পারি? হ্যালো,
হ্যাঁ,
এটা কোঅর্ডিনেটর, সরি ডিসকাসেন্ট, না আপনি একটু
সরি আমি আনমিউট করে
একটু দেখবেন। হ্যাঁ,
আমি ভাস্বতী অ্যাকচুয়ালি অনেকক্ষণ থেকে ওয়েট করছি, আমি একটু ভাস্বতীর প্রশ্নটা নিতে চাইছি। ওকে,
হ্যাঁ সরি, আমি একটা অন্য মানে জয়তিদিকে জিজ্ঞেস করছি, কারণ এই যে আপনি যদিও পিলগ্রিমেজ ট্রাভেলের কথা বললেন না, মানে ওটা বললেন যেটা আপনি আজকে বলবেন না, তো যেটা অলরেডি প্রেসক্রাইবড বাই মেন, যে তারা মেয়েরা পিলগ্রিমেজ ট্রাভেল করতে পারে, এটা মানে মোটামুটি ধরে নেওয়া হয়েছিল। কিন্তু হিন্দু বিধবারা যে দল বেঁধে পান্ডাদের সাহায্য নিয়ে ট্রাভেল করতে যেত পুরী, জগন্নাথ ধাম, শ্রীধাম, এইসব জায়গায়, সেটা তো একটা তাদের ক্ষেত্রেও একটা মানে ফ্রিডম বা একটা কোথাও মানে একটা মানে তাদের ট্রান্সগ্রেশনই বলুন বা ফ্রিডমের একটা মানে স্বাধীনতার স্বাদ, এবং সেখানে গিয়েও তো অনেক রকম সেক্সুয়াল রিলেশন বা অন্য রকম এক্সপ্লয়টেশন বা যাই বলুন, সেই ধরনের অভিজ্ঞতাও তাদের হয়েছে, মানে সেইগুলো তো অনেক ক্ষেত্রেই দেখা গেছে। তো এইটাকে কি করে তখন এতটা ছাড় দেওয়া হচ্ছে যে pilgrimage travel is allowed but not for leisure, for other purposes?
পিলগ্রিমেজ ট্রাভেলটা আসলে প্রথম থেকেই এসে গেছে, তাই না? মানে যখন এমনি ট্রাভেল ওয়াজ নট অ্যালাউড, শুধু শ্বশুর বাড়ি যাবে, বিয়ে করবে, মানে এইটুকুটাই অ্যালাউড মহিলাদের পক্ষে। পিলগ্রিমেজটা মানে যারা অন্তঃপুর থেকে বেরিয়ে পিলগ্রিমেজে যাচ্ছে, সেটা ওয়াজ অলসো মানে সেটা ওয়াজ অ্যালাউড, মানে সেটা মানে করা যেত, মানে সেটা ওয়াজ পার্ট অফ দ্য ইয়ে। সেই জন্যে মানে এই হ্যারাসমেন্ট ইত্যাদি হয়তো চিরদিনই ছিল, মানে এরকম তো নয় যে হঠাৎ করে মানে হয়েছে, চিরদিনই ছিল। সেগুলো ডিডন্ট গেট রিপোর্টেড, এবং সেইটা সত্যিও মানে ওরা ইয়ে করেছে আর কি, মানে সেটা মানে allowed মানে কি, pilgrimage was part of the tradition which was sanctioned আর কি, sanctioned by religion.
নির্জন সৈকতে সিনেমাটাতে যেটা দেখি যে একদল বিধবা তারা যাচ্ছেন বেড়াতে পুরীতে, সেই তো মানে একটা তাদের কোথাও একটা এক্সপ্রেশন তো হচ্ছে যে তারা মানে এই ডোমেস্টিক কোর্স থেকে বেরিয়ে এসে সেখানে গিয়েও কাজ করছে, হচ্ছে না তা না, কিন্তু হলো দ্যাট ফর देयर themselves only, not for the also. পৃথা কিছু বলছিল বোধহয়।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, প্লিজ গো অ্যাহেড পৃথা।
আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছিলাম যে এখানে তো একটা জিনিস এলো যে একটা আগে একজন বললেন যে ওই ন্যাশনালিজমের ব্যাপারটাও একটা রয়েছে, যে ওই যে অ্যাংলো ইন্ডিয়ানদেরকে বলা হচ্ছে যে ওরাই করছে আর কি সেক্সুয়াল হ্যারাসমেন্ট। এবং আমি আমার উইমেন্স জার্নালস এর উপর কাজ, পিরিয়ডিক্যালস এর উপর কাজ, তো আমি সেখানে কিন্তু দেখেছি যে দুজন খুব সাধারণ অজানা অচেনা মহিলা, মানে দুই বোন, চঞ্চলা চপলা বোধহয় সম্ভবত তাদের নাম, যতদূর আমার মনে পড়ছে, যে তারা এই ট্রাভেলিং এর টাইমে, ট্রেন ট্রাভেলিং এর টাইমে তারা যখন সেক্সুয়াল হ্যারাসমেন্ট হচ্ছে, এখন তখন তো আর যৌন নির্যাতন কথাটা তো লেখা নেই, লেখাটার মধ্যে ছিল যে তাদেরকে সাংঘাতিক ভাবে মানে পুরুষ যাত্রীরা বিরক্ত করছে বা তারা খুব অপদস্থ হচ্ছে পদে পদে, এরকম একটা ব্যাপার, তো মানসিক নির্যাতন হচ্ছে এবং তারা খুব সংকুচিত বোধ করছে। কিন্তু এখান থেকে রিপোর্টিংটা এইভাবে ছিল পিরিয়ডিক্যালে যে এই দুই বোন তারা কিন্তু রুখে দাঁড়ালো এবং আমার লেখাটা পড়ে মনে হয়েছিল যে এক ধরনের মার্শিয়াল আর্টের সাহায্যে তারা কিন্তু প্রতিবাদ করলো, কারণ দিয়েছিল লেখাটার মধ্যে এরকম ছিল যে তারা শারীরিক ভাবে প্রতিরোধ করতে সক্ষম হলো এই দুই বোন, এবং সেটা খুব অ্যাপ্রিসিয়েট করা হয়েছিল রিপোর্টিংটাতে, যে এইভাবেই বাঙালি মহিলারা যখন ট্রাভেলিং করবে তারা যেন এগুলো মাথায় রাখে, তারা যেন পুরুষের মুখাপেক্ষী না হয়ে থেকে শারীরিকভাবে শক্তিশালী হয়ে ওঠে, যাতে তারা এই ধরনের ট্রেন ট্রাভেলিং এর টাইমে যাতে তারা এইরকম ভাবে প্রস্তুত থাকতে পারে, প্রতিহত করতে পারে। এটা একটা দিক দেখেছিলাম। আরেকটা দিক, এই ট্রেন ট্রাভেলিং বা যে কোনো ট্রাভেলিং নিয়ে সেটাও পিরিয়ডিক্যালের একটা লেখাতে, এক মহিলার লেখাতে পড়েছিলাম, যে তিনি লিখেছিলেন যে এই ক্ষেত্রে পোশাকটা কতটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ, যে পোশাকটা এমন একটা পোশাক হওয়া উচিত যেখানে সে শারীরিক ভাবে সে সক্ষম হবে প্রতিরোধ করতে, তার প্রতি কোনো রকম যদি আক্রমণ হয় বা তাকে যদি হ্যারাস করা হয় তাহলে সে যেন শারীরিক ভাবে সক্ষম হয়, অর্থাৎ সে যেন হাত পা তুলে সে যেন প্রতিরোধ করতে পারে। এই ধরনের একটা কথা কিন্তু আসছে, অর্থাৎ সাধারণ, খুব সাধারণ, বললাম তো খুব অচেনা, মানে যাদের নামই কখনো শোনা যায় না, সেই রকম ওই দুই মহিলার কথা, দুই বোনের কথা রিপোর্টিং এ কিন্তু লেখা ছিল, আবার আলাদা করে ওই ট্রাভেলিং এর টাইমে লেখা ছিল।
আমি একটু জানতে চাইছি জয়তিদি, পৃথা যে কথা বললো, মানে এই দুজনের নাম যেটা দেওয়া হয়েছে সেটা কি তাদের আসল নাম, এর কোনো ইন্ডিকেশন আছে কি? কারণ ইউজুয়ালি অ্যানোনিমিটি উড বি দ্য নর্ম, ইউ নো। হ্যাঁ, সো এইটা কি তাদের আসল নাম, মানে সেটা কি আমরা কিছু জানতে পারি?
মানে আমার তো মনে হয় যে হয়তো আসল নাম নাও হতে পারে।
এক্স্যাক্টলি।
আর আরেকটা মানে জিনিস হচ্ছে গিয়ে যে এগুলো মানে ঠিক মানে সবাই মানে এক্সপ্রেস হয়তো করতো না, এবং কতটা করতো সেটা নিয়ে আর কি যথেষ্টই হয়তো ডিবেটস রয়েছে।
না, এই রিপোর্টিংটা কিন্তু পত্রিকা নিজে করছে না, এটা কোনো একটা জায়গায় বেরিয়েছে, সেটাকে পত্রিকা রিপোর্ট করছে, মানে লিখছে, মানে এটা এমন না যে পত্রিকা নিজে রিপোর্টটা করছে, মানে এটা কোনো একটা জায়গায় খবরটা পাবলিশ হয়েছে, সেই রিপোর্টটাকে পত্রিকা রিপ্রোডিউস করছে।
But the names may have been changed. That is what I was trying to say. আসল নাম হয়তো দেয়নি, সেটাই আমি বলতে চাইছি।
অনেক সময় এই অর্ডিনারি ট্রাভেলগস গুলোতে তেও প্রবাসিনী এরকম ধরনের করে আসে, মানে তারা হয়তো মানে পুরো নিজেদের নামেতে দেন না, শ্রী সৌ বলে মানে সিগনেচার করা, মানে এরকম ধরনের।
Purnadi, can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Purnadi. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gupta, Jayati, for your wonderful presentation. I have a very small question to you, ma'am. You were talking about the thing that women, initially, when they had started writing on their travel experiences, they were delineating their travel, all the difficulties that they had been facing, and the very question of their inner desire, that kind of urge to go for travel. And I think there was someone, initially there was a question whether, I think Purnadi had said, yes, Purnadi had initially asked you whether they have been encouraged by their male compatriots or not, because we find in the writings of Krishna Bhavini very much that she was being supported. It was her husband who really wanted her to accompany her, which her father-in-law did not want. So there was this kind of difference of opinion in amongst many, perhaps, but mostly belonging to the better, to the privileged sections of the contemporary society. But there's one thing regarding Prashnamoy. In fact, we know about Krishna Bhavini and others, that they're not about Prashnamoy. I'm not sure how she really traveled, because her education...
She traveled with her brothers, because she was separated from her husband very early on.
Yes.
She lived in her Bapir Bari, and there she learned the piano, etc., etc. So she traveled with her brothers. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
The other person who traveled by train, and of course, that has been written on, Kailash Bashini Devi. And, her husband was posted in these, in rural Bengal, and she went with her husband. She would, stay there. And she talks about train travel in a very positive kind of a way, because, that was a time of companionship, etc. So, amongst the elite, or amongst the, Brahmo Bhavapanno, people, this idea of a companionate marriage was also, coming across. So traveling with their menfolk, as in the case of later on Sarojini and others, Obula Bose, for that matter, that was a accepted kind of
and that was a kind of also social parlance, that they were at par with the colonial men, that their better house were really up to them to accompany them in the societal experiences, lives, and everything. But one thing but most of the time, ma'am, these women, they were, although they had this inner desire, whatsoever, but they were actually sponsored. What I mean to say is that they were actually sponsored by their male folks. So they were not financially capable enough of sponsoring their travel, even if they had that inner desire. So that inner desire being translated into reality, that was something which was being not only approved, which was being supported by the male folks of the family. Either the husbands or the supportive fathers or brothers, siblings. I mean, anyhow, it was the male folk who really wanted to support this women folk to embark upon their initial travel.
Yes, even in their initial education, as it were, their literacy.
Yes, ma'am.
Most cases, because the husband or because the brothers, helped them. That is why, and after they got married, the husband was able to encourage that. Only because of that it happened. And so, it's the social formations, and we are very definitely looking at elite woman in that sense of the term, right?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely. It was as if it seems that it was an extension of that Indian male project of educating their women, so as to also make them capable of, making them travelers, co-travelers, compatriot travelers with the male travelers. So it was an extension of that project. It seems to me in this way only. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes. It was like a controlled emancipation, as Professor Shumit Sarkar has said, isn't it, Jayati?
Yes.
Controlled emancipation. So thank you, Jayati, very much for this extremely interesting and enlightening talk. May I now invite Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta to please deliver her talk on Hariprabha Takeda in Japan. Professor Dasgupta, please.
Thank you, Dr. Ghose. And first of all, can you hear me? Because my computer sometimes plays up.
Yes, we can hear you, yes.
Right. So first of all, a big thank you to Women's History Conclave for inviting me to this talk. And I have to confess that I have a certain nervousness because I'm a bit of an imposter over here. I'm not a scholar of women's history. If you had listened to what Parshati had, when she introduced me, all my publications are on Adivasis and marginal communities. And I have started to think about women's history because of my teaching. Because here in Rome at Sapienza, I teach a course on women's history, and that has gotten me into reading about women's experiences, and I have become interested in following some of these facets, some of these areas of research topic. I do not claim to be an expert at all, and I would just like to share some of these ideas that I have formed about travel writings. I have with me here a PowerPoint which I would like to share. Just a moment. Right. Just a moment. How does one? Okay, so you can see the PowerPoint. Where is it gone now?
Yes,
we can see.
So I will be talking about marriage, migration, and identity, and Hariprabha Takeda in Japan. And in fact, today Hariprabha Takeda is fairly well known. Even say around 20 years ago, there were some writings on Hariprabha Takeda, not much, but despite, in fact, a very remarkable life, she had shunned away from any kind of publicity in her older years. And when she died in 1972 in Jalpaiguri in Western Bengal, though she came from Dhaka, and despite this very remarkable life, her memory had been all but obliterated in the altered demographics of post-1947 Dhaka. However, today there has been a resurgence of interest in Hariprabha Takeda as the first Bengali traveler to Japan, and also the first Bengali woman who had married a Japanese, an interracial marriage. And there is, in fact, a docufilm in Bangladesh, which came out last year, directed by Roshik Bariktar and produced by Eliza Binte Elahi, Hariprabha Takeda, an unsung traveler of Bengal. And her book, Bongo Mohira's Japan Jatra, has been reprinted in Dhaka, in Kolkata, and it has been translated into English by Somdatta Mondol last year, The Journey of a Bengali Woman to Japan. And also Professor Jayati Gupta had also translated large extracts in her book. And also, there is now a Japanese translation of her book, which perhaps has been published by now, but I'm not very sure. So I will be looking at some of these texts. Of these, Bongo Mohila Japan Jatra, which was published in 1915, is something that can be called a travel or travel account, especially as the name suggests, Japan Jatra. It is written in the form of a travel memoir. And Hariprabha first visited Japan as a young bride in 1912 when she spent 4 months in the country of her in-laws. And so it was published in 1915 from Dhaka, and we can see, I don't know whether you can see, yes. So Kumari Shantiprabha Mollik Kotrik Prokashito. So Kumari Shantiprabha Mollik was a sister. And the book was also fairly well known because you find anonymous reviews of Bogo Mohila Japan Jatra coming out almost immediately in Probashi and Bharati in the same year. And then after a gap, you have these these are not in that sense travel writings, but her recollections of her life in Japan, especially when she's writing these essays, Japanese Shantan Palon Unari Shikha, Child Rearing and Women's Education in Japan, published in Bharatvarsha in 1949, and then Japanese Nari again in Bharatvarsha the same year. And finally, there was a book, a memoir. It is not really a book, and this is not so much a travel writing, travel log, as it was a personal recollection, a memoir entitled Jukte Giorgiolito Japan. And so it was this, the last one was written in the form of a diary, and it narrated her experiences in wartime Japan when she had become very closely associated with Azad Hind Fauji's war efforts. And and I will be just taking all these texts together and discussing them together. So it is not only about the travel writings, but I will see all the writings together. Now, in the first place, how do we see Hariprabha Takeda? So there has been, as I said, in recent years, a lot of writings on Hariprabha. And incidentally, one of the earliest writings, which is completely forgotten today, was published in 1992 by Gautam Yogi, who discussed Hariprabha's social role in connection with the discussion of his paper was on the mother's home in Dhaka. Some very influential discussions, among them is Bhashwar Mukhopadhyay. And Bhashwar Mukhopadhyay described Hariprabha as an obscure housewife unschooled in the ways of new learning. And he argued that Hariprabha's travel narrative was informed not by modernity, but by pre-modern textualization, in keeping with age-old traditions of Chorit Katha and Tirthojatra or pilgrimage. And later, again, there were several other writings on Hariprabha by Shimonti Sen, by Madhurima Mukhopadhyay, who wrote a very interesting PhD thesis, but never published it, so far as I know. Also, you have Sharbani Gupta, but all of them, whether Shimonti, Madhurima Mukhopadhyay, or Sharbani, they have more or less accepted this idea of Hariprabha as a housewife, despite their otherwise very, very interesting, incisive analysis. The more recent writings, like Professor Gupta's recent book, also Shati Moitro, have highlighted instead her public role. And on the other end of the frame, you also have Muntasir Mamun, and this is, and he's talking about the significance of Hariprabha and asserting that what was really significant, আমার কাছে যেটা গুরুত্বপূর্ণ মনে হয়েছে তা হলো এক মহিলার দৃষ্টিভঙ্গি যা এই শতকে কোনো আধুনিক দৃষ্টিভঙ্গির সঙ্গে তুলনীয়। সেই অর্থে হরিপ্রভা তাকেদাকে ঢাকা শহরের প্রথম আধুনিক মহিলা বলা কি খুব অযৌক্তিক হবে? So this is, if there is anybody who is not a Bengali speaker, this is that what Professor Mamun was arguing is that Hariprabha Takeda's accounts reveal this the life, the understanding of life as was there in his book. And he concludes his life should be considered to be the first modern woman of Dhaka. Now, while I do agree that the Jibon Bodh, or the ideas of life as found in the Mufassil, a small town, a smaller town, her writings reveal this, bring this to light and show that there was in many ways, how women in small towns far away from the metropolis, of course, Dhaka is not such a small town, but still it was not Calcutta, nonetheless had much larger and wider understandings of life and their role in and their expectations in that life. But I think nonetheless to call her Dhaka Shohori Prothom Adhunik Mahila is a bit of a hyperbole. Now I would instead, when I talk about Hariprabha, there are some points that I would like to highlight, and I would argue that Hariprabha is to be viewed as a product of a certain milieu in Dhaka. So I will not see her as this first modern Bengali woman. In fact, she came from this milieu where there were others who would share, the same kind of modernity as her. So, I would talk about, for example, Shanti Prabha, also Hariprabha's mother, Nagindra Bala, etc. And there would be others in her milieu about whom I do not have the information. Secondly, I would also argue that this text, it is not really, we should not just see this as the literary product, the Bongomuhilar Japan Jatra, as the product of a housewife who is confined, who is limited within the Shongshar or the family. Instead, I would argue that it was informed by feminist consciousness, and it can be seen as a statement of early feminism. It is not apolitical as it has been suggested. And although, in fact, her choice of the subject matter, which I will come to, and which perhaps is fairly well known to this audience, was dictated by the personal motivations, her narrative did not only reflect a restricted worldview of a housewife operating within this limited boundaries of the household, or even located within a pre-modern world of a private sphere to which only a small degree of modernity had been imparted by the act of travel. Instead, I would argue that Hariprabha's observations were informed by her own experiences and the intellectual milieu of Dhaka, to which her family belonged. And in fact, all these in late 19th, early 20th century India, these questions relating to womanhood, family life, motherhood, these were part of the public discourse on the nation. And with the nationalist debate on aspect of women's role in society, so this women's question itself was a predominant political and social issue of the time. So Hariprabha response, or the way in which he responded to Japan, the way in which he looked at Japan, this I would state was a modernist response, not something that was connected with age-old traditions of Churikotha, etc., etc. And furthermore, if Bongomohila Japan Jatra was imbued with an incipient feminism, which was as much political as it was personal, this, the memoir, Juthe Jorjorita Japan, this was actually a clear statement of Hariprabha's anti-colonial sympathies and political participation. Now, when we read these two texts together, these should not be simply seen as a kind of a transition from the private to the public sphere, or as the effect of external compulsions on an obscure housewife certainly having to interact with international personalities or national leaders. Instead, what I have underlined is that the historical reality locates Hariprabha as a middle-class Brahmo woman with an established familial and personal history of social engagement and confrontation with the social and political issues of early 20th century Bengal. If we just very quickly take a look at who was Hariprabha anyway. She came from a well-known liberal, philanthropic, nationalist-minded family in Dhaka. She was the daughter of Shashi Bhushan and Vikrumala Molvik. Now, Shashi Bhushan Molvik is usually referred to, the surname, the family name is often given as Molvik, but sometimes also as Bushu Molvik. So the caste name Bushu often is sometimes left out and just is often referred to as Shashi Bhushan Molvik and Shashi Bhushan Bushu Molvik interchangeably. Shashi Bhushan had worked first as the sub-inspector of police and later he became a full-time Brahmo missionary associated with the Dhaka Prabhuvidhan Brahmo Samaj. And he was an ardent follower of Keshav Chandra Sen. And like his mentor, Shashi Bhushan also was keenly interested in women's emancipation. About Hariprabha's education, again, we do not have much information, but since, Shashi Bhushan was one of these leading Brahmo missionaries of Dhaka, we can assume that she had been educated at Eden School, which was set up for the education of Brahmo girls in Dhaka. And very interesting, we have some examples of her early writings. So, as one of them is that the book, Povitratma Premika Shadhi Gandevi, Madam Guyon Jiban Kachori, the great soul saint Gandevi. So, this is the life story of Madame Guyon, which is a biography of the 17th century French mystic. So this choice, first of all, discovering this French mystic, Madame Guyon, and wanting to write about her, this is indeed a very unusual choice. And it shows a certain level of sensitivity, literary sensibility, and the accomplishment of the young girl. And we come to then the Matri Niketan. Shashi Bhushan had been involved with the movement to suppress trafficking of young girls in East Bengal. And with the help of fellow Brahmos, Shashi Bhushan had set up the Girls' Rescue Home in 1896 with the aim of rescuing girl children, both of the upper and lower castes, from prostitution and also to arrange for their social rehabilitation. The rescue home originally functioned from his house, and Shashi Bhushan, together with Nagendra Bala and their entire family, jointly participated in its management and maintenance. And later, due to the shortage of space and funds, the rescue home was shifted to the neighboring village of Khilgaon and renamed Matri Niketan, or the Mother's Home. And the scope of activities was also widened to include widows and orphans together with trafficked girls. Nagendra Bala died in 1907, and after her death, the responsibility of running the home was passed on to Hariprabha, the couple's eldest daughter. And in this supervisory role that she had, Hariprabha was in charge of the everyday functioning of the home, had to look after the well-being of the inmates, oversee their education. And moreover, since the home was frequently visited by European administrators, officers, and missionaries, we can assume that Hariprabha, despite her youth, she must have been, 16 or 17 at that time, she had become accustomed to public interactions with prominent personalities of the region. Now we come to this very unusual marriage. So in 1907, Shashi Bhushan arranged Hariprabha's marriage with Uemon Takeda in Dhaka. Uemon had come from, during the Meiji period. He was a migrant of Meiji Japan, and and he ended up in British India in the beginning of the 20th century, together with his younger brother, Tushan. During the Meiji period, the political isolation of Japan came under the Tokugawa shogunate had come to an end, and there was a spurt in emigration to foreign countries. And although the main trend of migration was towards the United States, Brazil, and Hawaii, the period also witnessed considerable the influx of Japanese fortune seekers to British India, with whom Meiji Japan had considerable trade relations. The Takeda brothers procured employment as chemists in the Bulbul soap factory in Dhaka. And in fact, Dhaka by then had already become a leading center of soap making in Eastern India, particularly after the Swadeshi movement. And in fact, the Bulbul soap factory was set up in 1903 as a purely Swadeshi enterprise. And after marrying Hariprabha, Uemon started his own business in the name of Indo-Japanese Soap Factory, which, however, did not succeed. It failed in the long run. And he settled permanently in Dhaka. And besides his business, Uemon also participated wholeheartedly in the management of Matriniketan and contributed a part of his income for its upkeep. This interracial marriage between a Bengali woman and a Japanese man, unusual for the times, was in fact in keeping with the liberal outlook of the Mollik family. And in the memoirs of the family members, we see it is mentioned that Hariprabha also had taken the initiative to arrange the marriage of Uemon's younger brother Toshan with a Bengali woman from Dhaka named Rani. And Hariprabha's niece, Sanjukta Dasgupta, recalls that Shoshi Bhushan believed that foreign collaboration and international marriage would lay the foundations of Indian modernity. So, and specifically, it was this idea of the Asian marriage between two countries with a shared heritage and culture, which appeared to have inspired Shoshi Bhushan to arrange this marriage. And this is also, of course, reflective of this great respect with which Indian nationalists viewed the resurgence of Japan in the last quarter of the 19th century, when Japan was studied with great interest by Indian middle classes, and the spiritual and cultural ties and shared histories of the two countries were discussed in both Bengali and the English journals and newspapers of the time. And during this time, we find many of these articles, some like there was this anonymous article, Japaner Bortoman Unnotir Mool Potton, published in Bharati in 1881, which attributed Japan's success to the, and I quote, selfless desire of every Japanese, from the king to the commoner, for the country's welfare, close quotes. Articles also, there were also articles which were the Bengali translations of European writings on Japan. And among them, the most noted is Jyotirendra Thakur's translation of the writings of the French philosopher Félicien Chalais, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, which emphasized the particularity of the Buddhist-inspired Japanese culture and identified Japanese values of nationalism, homage to the Mikado, worship of ancestors, respect for parents and grandparents, selflessness, loyalty, courage and dedication, and love for nature as the reasons for the nation's development. So by the early 20th century, Japan had become a household idea in Bengal, and in the middle class imagination, a close connection was envisaged, linking the advancement of Japan with that of India. And Hariprabha's family belonged to this middle class. the liberal milieu which had access to this kind of nationalist literature and debates. Now we come to the first travelogue, the first text, Bongo Mohilar Japan Jatra. I'm not going to go into a detailed analysis of the text since this has been discussed at length by many of these scholars I've already mentioned. But I shall highlight some points, just certain points. Now, in the discussion following Jayati's lecture, the question came up, why did these women travel? And in Hariprabha's account, this was very clearly enunciated. The reason for her first trip was purely personal, to meet her in-laws. Bongo Mohila Japan Jatra reflects her excitement at finally getting to see, going to her Shoshur Bari, which is, of course, an event of momentous significance to a bride. Now, having married a Japanese, she and indeed her entire family had doubted that this would ever have been possible, given the expense, the distance, the hazards of the journey across the seas. So, explaining her motivations, she wrote, Hariprabha wrote, when I married a Japanese, none could imagine that I would someday go to Japan. But I always had a strong desire to go there. I yearned for the blessings of my parents-in-law. My heart was filled with joy when I received their photograph with a letter containing their blessings and their eagerness to see us. Now, this very the exceptionality, the singularity of a Bengali woman's trip to Japan, to her in-laws' residence in Japan, this had generated considerable public curiosity and excitement. And the trip was made possible by very generous financial grants by benefactors like the Maharaja of Dinajpur, and also the young couple, they also received monetary assistance from Japanese business acquaintance of Uemon Takeda. And her departure from Dhaka, this was in fact a public event. It was preceded by a Brahmo prayer service, which was held first at Matri Niketan in the village of Khilgaon, and also at their family residence in Dhaka, and attended by people from the village and members of both the Nobobidhan and the Shadharan Brahmo Samaj. And also the deputy magistrate of Dhaka attended the service. Now, in Japan, the main thing that she really talks about is her relationship to her, with her in-laws, and she expressed this great pride and happiness at the generosity and warmth shown to her by her in-laws. And as a Brahmo, Hariprabha, of course, could contract a consensual marriage. But she was not unaware of the fate of many young Bengali girls, especially from the upper caste schooling families, trapped in polygamous marriages, and the restrictions and the drudgery that they experienced in their marital homes. She was also, in the Matriniketan, dealing with trafficked women and abandoned widows. She was very much aware of this plight, or the plight of the women, and also the kind of how marriage was just a matter of luck. So she could indeed revel in her good fortune to have a kind, understanding parents-in-law. In Somnatta Mondol's translation of Hariprabha's travel account, Michael Fisher wrote a foreword, and Michael Fisher argued that although her Japanese family acted with kind hospitality, they maintained a distant and formal attitude towards Hariprabha, who was treated as an honored foreign guest rather than as a member of the household. But this, I think, is a misrepresentation, because Hariprabha constantly, repeatedly refers to the special bond that she could establish with her mother-in-law and the kindness of the other relatives and neighbors. And she wrote that, I quote, rather than disliking me or expressing any distaste, they were always eager to ensure my happiness, close quotes. And in fact, at the end, at the very end of her travel account, she expressed her sadness at having to leave her mother-in-law and return to India. So, and I quote, at the time of our return trip, my mother-in-law, along with one of my sisters-in-law and her young son, came to see us off at Kobe. She was in tears when bidding farewell to us. I told Takeda-san, everyone took such good care of me, but I could not carry out my duties. Hearing that, they sorrowfully lamented. We have not done anything. It is you who had to experience difficulties abroad. Having found such a simple-hearted and caring mother-in-law in a foreign land, who bestowed on me a mother's love and care, I wish to stay on with her. But how is that possible? Besides this intimate view of her social body, her subject matter also dealt with the home, marriage, domesticity, education, and the family. And of course, and her account captures these vignettes of Japanese life and culture and domestic conventions to which she had privileged access as the daughter-in-law. And since Hariprabha's narrative was intended to familiarize the Bengali reading public with Japanese culture, she wrote in great details about the organization of the household, the interior decoration, the food habits, culinary arts, social behavior, traditional costumes, etc. About marriage, in fact, there was a large part of her narrative dealt with marriage. And she writes that the Japanese do not get married at an early age. Men get married around the age of 25 to 30 years, while for women 16 to 20 years is the usual age of marriage. Japanese people do not get married before this age. Young men and women choose each other when they reach the desirable age of marriage. When the choice is of the parents, they express their own opinion. In some cases, the opinion of the girl is not given much importance. She also observed that while there were prescribed rituals for birth and death and for paying homage to deities, there were no special rituals for marriage. And this was, according to her, because the Japanese looked upon marriage only as a physical union. And I quote Hariprabha in this. And she writes that they considered it to be a ceremony of revelry and did not feel the necessity to have any spirituality attached to the custom of marriage. And in these kind of observations, one can see that implicit, unstated reference to the reality pertaining to her own home country, where the large majority of the women rarely had the opportunity to exercise their choice in marriage. At the same time, that she critically observed, contrasted, and assessed the various forms of interiority that existed in Bengal and Japan, she also emphasized particularly the role of the mother and motherhood, and particularly the roles the mothers played in education. So she contrasted, in fact, very unfavorably the Bengali mothers with their Japanese counterparts. Japanese women devoted their time and energy in educating their children, while Bengali women frittered away most of their time in routine domestic chores, cooking and eating, activities which she felt could be very easily curtailed. And she also emphasized the extreme patience that Japanese mothers displayed in rearing children as compared to their Indian counterparts. So in this explicit critique of the way in which the Bengali mothers avoided their responsibilities in properly raising their children, Hariprabha was echoing much of the contemporary debates on motherhood and the duties of mothers which were published in the journals of contemporary Bengal. So to her, the Japanese system was the ideal which the Bengali mothers could pursue to their advantage. And the mother, moreover, occupied a very important position when it came to the question of education of a child in Japan. So during the Meiji and the Taisho periods in Japan, there were educational reforms that had been carried out which attach great emphasis on the role of the mother. So there was this, what was known as the Ryosai Kenbo system of education, the Ryosai Kenbo model of education, which is the good wives and wise mother, the good wives and wise mother model of education in Taisho, Japan. And there was also this idea of the Kate Kyoiku, that is the home education. So established through the Ordinance on Girls' High Schools in 1899, the Ryosai Kenbo model represented the ideal of Japanese women's education in pre-Second World War period and linked the idea of the Japanese national polity with the ideology of the family nation. Now, Hariprabha, this is also the same time as this debate on the role of women and education, which was happening in Japan. You had the same kind of debate also in India. And the role of the mother in the new reformed family, the creation, and the role of the mother in the creation of the nation. So whether in Japan or in Bengal, girls' education was not the concern of a private sphere or of an individual family, but this contributed to the nation-building process. And in order to gather practical knowledge of the functioning of girls' education, Hariprabha and Miriam Takeda, they visited several girls' schools, and there are these detailed descriptions of this in her travel narrative, and also further descriptions in her essay, Japani Shantan Palu Unanishika. So now I move on to the second text, Judhe Jorjurito, Japan. So this implicit feminism in this account of the private domain, this is more evident in the second account, which was almost entirely concerned with the public domain. Published in 2007, long after her death, Judhe Jorjurito Japan recounts the life of the Takedas in Japan during the war years between 1941 to 48. And the final text, this final text dealt specifically with her participation in radical nationalist politics that was shaped by the anti-colonial ideology and the political turmoil of the wartime years. Together with the portrayal of wartime Japan, this account gives a brief but very vivid description of the activities of the Azakan Forge in Japan. Now, this memoir most probably was written after her return to India in 1949, because right at the outset, Hariprabha declares that Japan had become a dream to me. Some parts appear to be culled from a diary that she may have maintained during the war years. And in this account, or this memoir, Hariprabha's case is more critical, perhaps, than it had been in the first account of Japan, so which I will come to shortly. The decision to move to Japan was because it was taken by the Takedas in 1941, since women would be interned as an enemy alien in India. And again, the initial, this text is much more scattered in the sense that there were some places where it was a lot of details were given, but there were also some very sketchy references at times. The Takedas reached the port city of Kobe on 21st November 1941. And after staying in their village for a few days, they visited Tokyo, where they met the Indian revolutionary Rashbihari Bose. They were to meet other Indian revolutionaries, Swami Satyanand Puri, Sardar Pritam Singh, Mr. Iyer, and someone just written as mentioned as A. Muhammad, who were to come to Tokyo from Singapore. Unfortunately, their plane met with an accident, and Hariprabha then attended a funeral ceremony organized at Bangaji Temple in Tokyo to pay her respects. And it was here that she had the opportunity to meet and personally converse with the Japanese Prime Minister with General Tojo, but she does not tell us more about her conversation or about her impressions. And finally, she also, Rashbihari Bose invited her to participate in the INA's war efforts, and she received a call from the Tokyo radio station under the instruction of Rashbihari Bose to be the war correspondent in Bengali. And from 15th December 1941, Hariprabha started working at the radio station as the Bangla language war correspondent, while Women Takeda secured the job of a Japanese expert during the Bengali transmissions. And in 1943, she started this from 1943. And finally, in 1943, she also met Subhash Chandra Bose. And this is also something which comes as a very interesting, her relationship or the way in which she looked at Subhash Bose, because her decision to participate, to take up this offer, was not something that just occurred out of a chance encounter in Japan. In fact, like many other Bengalis who disagreed with Gandhian politics and the tactics of Satyagraha, it would appear that Hariprabha's family had looked at Netaji's Subhash Bose's radicalism and defiant patriotism as an attractive alternative, which imbued in them the spirit of middle class, what has been described by the Chakraborty as middle class radicalism. So Hariprabha's memoirs just give us some of these hints. It is not very clearly developed, but we get some hints about her nationalist beliefs and her participation in active politics in Bengal in 1930s. So we get the information that in response to Netaji's call, she, along with other women, participated in processions demanding full independence and unfurling the national flag on 26 January 1930. So there was, from this single entry that she made in the memoir, we get this idea, at least I get this idea, that she was already attracted by Subhash Bose and the alternative that he provided. And she met again Subhash Bose on 9th November 1944, along with other Indians, and had very detailed discussions with him about the INA's war propaganda. The second account also tells us about her experiences as a migrant in wartime Japan. So during their stay in Tokyo, the Takedas faced tremendous hardships. Food was scarce, as were proper residential quarters. Food rationing was in force, and because of their work, the Takedas lacked the time to collect their rations. However, she received the help from the people of the neighborhood, which was very willingly extended because she was a foreigner and he was elderly. Her experiences as a migrant were not always pleasant, especially as she had to overcome several bureaucratic hurdles. For instance, as an alien, she was once detained in the train to Tokyo in 1943, and she had to show all her documents and also the letter of permission that foreigners needed to enter and to leave the city. And she gives an account of this heated argument followed with Takeda-san, heated argument between the Japanese officers and Takeda-san. Later, on making inquiries over the telephone, they let me go. However, despite her foreignness, she felt herself as part of the larger Japanese community with whom she could share their everyday experience of grief at the death and destruction. Now, I'll just skip over this and I'll just come to the last days, the final part of the memoir and the recording the last days of the war and Japan's defeat. And this part reads just like a diary, noting the very significant events of the day. In fact, there are just very short sentences that she would sometimes enter in her diary. In the first sentence, she observed, the atom bomb was dropped on 6th August at Hiroshima and on 9th August at Nagasaki. There was no other explanation or description of how the Japanese reacted. And a similarly unemotional statement dated 20th August reported the news they received of Netaji's death. But you could see her emotions, which came out in another entry in the diary, where she simply had taken down, she just wrote this message, Netaji's message. I have fought until the last for my country's independence. Continue the struggle, dear countrymen. Before long, India shall be free. Long live free India, Azad Hind. So she noted this down, but no other explanation. Now, because of her marriage, Hariprabha never felt herself to be an alien or an outsider, but identified herself totally with the Japanese people. And while in general she sympathized with the plight of the Japanese, she did differ from them in a very fundamental aspect, and that is their unquestioning faith in the emperor and their determination never to surrender. So, and she wrote, here, in fact, this particular entry is I found this particularly interesting because she writes, the Japanese considered their emperor to be God. They believed that Japan shall never surrender so long as there was a person alive. Who can rid them of this belief? When I cried once, they forbade me to say such a thing and warned me not to bring such words to my mouth. Only their emperor can make them break faith. Now, this is very significant because in the first travelogue in Bangabundla Japan Jatra, she had discussed the Japanese attitude to the emperor in very different tone, in a very unemotional, factual entry. And where she simply writes, Japanese worship their emperor as God. They believe that his good deeds and blessings of the ancestors enable them to overcome tragedies. So this was a very matter-of-fact way of just explaining the Japanese relationship with the emperor. But in Jutta Chorchini Japan, again, it's understated, but you can see that anguish that when she writes that, when I tried once, they forbade me to say such a thing and warned me not to bring such words to my mouth. Only their emperor can make them break faith. So For her, from the beginning, the war had seemed to be a destructive enterprise that had simply brought death and desolation to the country. And having lived the life of a colonized subject in British India, she could not have found this prospect of subjecthood to a hereditary monarch to have been very attractive. Now, finally, the Japanese surrender. Again, this is, after just silences, you find these being mentioned on particular dates. So on 15th, in fact, you have her memoirs. Finally, she talks about Emperor Hirohito's dual voice broadcast on 15th August, when the Emperor Hirohito announced the surrender of Japan to the Allied forces. And as Hariprabha noted, it was the first time that the emperor was heard on the radio by the Japanese people. Now, in fact, for example, the American historian John Dower had shown this very diverse nature of the public reaction to the emperor's speech, and there have been some who listened silently and continued to live as best as they could. There were some Army and Navy officers who had chosen suicide over surrender, and there were the crowds which shed tears. And Dower wrote that although the crowd shed tears, their tears reflected a multitude of sentiments. There was anguish, there was bereavement, there was regret and anger, there was a loss of purpose. And you find these same observations in Hariprabha's memoirs, where she writes, "In every home in Japan there is grief and lamentation. Husbands and sons are killed, children dead from starvation, no food, no clothes. They accepted the emperor's order, but everyone seemed bereft of words." So the silence was the silence of anguish and betrayal. Now I come to the final. Part of the final point, and this is after the war, it became increasingly difficult. Sorry, this should be 1948, not 1946. So after the war, it became increasingly difficult for the Takedas to continue to live in Japan because of women's poor health and meager resources. And after a long year's struggle with bureaucratic regulations, the couple made their way back to India. But they no longer had a home in Dhaka because Dhaka had become a part of, it was the capital of East Pakistan, and the Malik family had shifted to West Bengal. As a childless couple, the Takeda sought refuge in Jalpaiguri, and with Hariprabha's younger sister Oshrubala and her family. Women, Takeda died soon afterwards, and he died a broken man. Hariprabha's nephew mentions that Women never recovered his health or his spirits after his return to India. He could not forget the humiliation of Japanese defeat and died lamenting Japan's loss and Emperor Hirohito's surrender. Now, it is interesting that Uemon, who had lived outside Japan for nearly 40 years, and as an immigrant in Dhaka, he spoke Bangla, adopted Bangla attire, had lived the life of a middle-class Bengali Bhadralok. But he remained defined through his primary identity as a Japanese. Now, in conclusion, what I want to bring together is this idea of the private and the public. And as I said, when we look at these two texts, we should not see this as a transition from the private domain to the public domain. Instead, what I have argued is that we cannot actually, the private and the public cannot be so neatly separated. The public life, the public domain, was constantly shaped by the private and vice versa. And secondly, what I would like to see these narratives not simply as travel logs, but also as a migrant literature, recounting a middle-class migrant's life in a foreign land. So these accounts contain critical reflections, both implicit and explicit, on Bengal society under colonial rule, observations sharpened through comparisons with Japan. Both Hariprabha and her husband had been migrants at some point of time in their lives. They were circular migrants who returned to their base in Bengal after a sojourn in Japan. Although Hariprabha's first trip was of a short duration of 4 months, she had seen herself not as an outsider visiting a foreign country, but as a bride visiting her marital home. It was a marriage which shaped Hariprabha's response and instilled in her the desire to embrace Japan wholeheartedly. Marriage was the factor which led her to adapt and embrace a different culture. But Japan already had certain specific traits which had brought Japan close to the world of Bengali internationalism. The Asian resurgence, the shared culture, Buddhist values, all of this made Hariprabha's marriage choice a cultural statement of self-assertion and independence. While the private and the public spheres are usually seen as separate, insulated domains, history shows that there is constant transactions between the two, with consequent reconfiguration of positionality and identity. Hariprabha juggled with ease her multiple identities as a wife, a daughter-in-law, and even an Indian revolutionary, and could situate herself in the in-between space between two cultures. Women, about whom we know very little actually, on the other hand, despite his long absence and his adoption of the externalities of Bengaliness, retained his primary identity till the very end. Hariprabha looked at Japan, keeping Bengal in her mind, whereas women remained the Japanese subject of the empire, despite living the greater part of his life as a Bengali. Thus, while married, okay, so I just leave it over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dasgupta, for that very illuminating, very informative talk. I have a very small question. You said that Hariprabha's marriage was arranged by her father, Shoshibhushan. So, what was the reaction in society? I mean, society's, intercaste marriage itself was forbidden, and here she's getting married to a Japanese. What was the reaction in society as such?
No, that is actually very interesting, but I don't have any information about that. But this is a marriage which is happening within a very small circle, a Brahmo circle. So the question of caste would not, and especially, a very committed Brahmo missionary, of course, when I say the question of caste would not matter so much, I mean, within the upper educated castes, it would be a very different thing if there is a marriage across the upper and lower caste boundaries. But of course, this was very singular. The hint that I get when I see all the information from different sources is that there was a general recognition of this, the uniqueness. The Bengali woman marrying a Japanese. The father now whether Hariprabha married, whether it was her own choice or the father organized the marriage. Again, this is very difficult to say. It could also well have been that Hariprabha had come across women and in fact had kind of expressed her preferences. In any case, even if her father had made this choice, it would Hariprabha's it was not forced upon her. But again, you see this that when Hariprabha herself also tried to organize, make these kind of interracial marriages. So yes, this was very, very interesting within. So this is not just an average ordinary Bengali traveler or an average ordinary family. They were very unique in many ways.
Right, because when Pandita Ramabai, for example, she got married to a lower caste man and who was poor, there was tremendous reaction to that intercaste marriage. So I was just kind of wondering what would the society's reaction be to this kind of international marriage, if we may say so.
International marriages were rare, but it's not that it did not absolutely happen. There are other kinds of examples. Again, they are all of them very, very exceptional families.
Right.
So yes, it would be interesting, if I could have followed up the newspaper, which I couldn't, the newspapers of Dhaka, to see if there were any kinds of, letters to the editor or any kind of comments on her marriage. But this is something I don't know. But yes, this was. It did kind of excite the public imagination, especially when she went embarked on her first trip. There was a lot of public participation. So again, this is very, very, I think, interesting. In fact, yes, like interracial marriages, you have, Anuda Shankar Rai. Then also, for example, but interracial marriage, this happened in China, where you have, for example, Dr. Kotnis's marriage with the Chinese nurse Kuo Qinglang. But that took place in China.
Jyotindra Mohan Sengupta also married Nelly
Sengupta.
Yes, Nelly Sengupta. So of course, it's very rare, but it's not that it did not happen, and it would happen within a very, very exceptional background.
Yes.
Yes, anyone else with any question?
Yes, yes, Sanjukta, my book has a small para on this marriage, Hariprabha's marriage to women Takeda. As far as I remember, Veman had a brother who was also in Dhaka. He too had married a Bengali. এটা আমি কোথাও কোথাও রেফারেন্স পেয়েছিলাম
Toshan had married Rani. This was a wedding which was organized by Hariprabha. It is said that she played a kind of a matchmaker, the role of a matchmaker in organizing this.
Yes. And secondly, I'm very intrigued to hear that Hariprabha had acted as a war correspondent, Bangla war correspondent. Recently, I was reading a lot about these comfort women, the Korean women whom the Japanese soldiers sexually exploited, abducted in course of the war, and just used them for their own sexual pleasure. So, and also in 1937, probably Japan had invaded China and raped thousands and thousands of Chinese women. So there was a lot of sexual violence happening in course of the war, and Japan especially was guilty of this kind of horrendous sexual violence. So as a woman war correspondent, did Hariprabha write about about these acts of violence and gross human rights violation and violence?
She was a correspondent in the sense that she was officially she called herself the war correspondent, but she was actually the radio correspondent. Okay, and secondly, of course, it is not expected that she's going to write this news of the sexual slavery and the rapes in China. This would not, of course, be carried back to the civilian population in Japan. This is something that would come out much later. Even today, this process of recognize that these took place and the official apologies. This is still a very, very pertinent subject today. So it is not likely that during the wartime emergency situation, these kind of news would have percolated back to Tokyo. And whether the Takedas had any idea, or Hariprabha had any idea of all this is difficult to assess. I would imagine that at least she doesn't make any, of course, any reference to it. And I would imagine that that there is, even if she read about it later in her life after coming back to India, by that time, Japan had already become a much more glorified memory, than anything else. So, no, I don't find any kind of critical assessment. It is possible that she simply didn't know it. That
she was not aware of it. Yeah, that's more natural that she was not aware of.
এবং ইন্ডিয়ান প্রেসও কিন্তু সাইলেন্ট ছিল মানে অ্যাবাউট দিস মানে
পরে বেরিয়েছে
এটা অনেক অবভিয়াসলি মানে এগুলো তো মানে পোস্ট ওয়ার টাইম অনেক পরে এগুলো আস্তে আস্তে
ঠিক রাইট ঠিক
Can I ask a question, Sanjukta? Parna, can I ask?
Please, Jayati.
Sanjukta, have you found out how much of Japanese did Hariprabha know? Because her husband knew Bangla because he was living in Dhaka and all that. And and the initial time that she went, I don't think Hariprabha really knew Japanese, isn't it? So later on, did she pick up Japanese?
Again, this is very interesting because absolutely there is, in this, her nephew brought out Jorjorito Japan, and that also has certain recollections of her other family members. Her nephew has a section, also her niece Mojuda Shupto. They don't talk about this at all. So I would imagine, yes, a certain amount of Japanese maybe to get by, but how fluent she had become, whether she had studied Japanese, again, I don't have any idea because there is no indication in these texts. No, this is not enough.
Her nephew, when I was researching at the National Library, one was able to get in touch with the nephew. And at that point of time, he was living in Naktola, this Tolika jail. He did say that a lot of her writings, and especially photographs, because I was looking for photographs, and he said that much of it got, I think,
stolen,
washed away. In a flood.
About the flood, Jalpaiguri flood, yes, in 1968.
So,
And also many of her personal things were stolen.
Yeah, and there was this large format kind of a page which was folded up and all that, where she had written the details of that Jorjorito Japane, মানে সেই নোটস গুলো, সেটার আমার একটু বোধহয় ছবি তুলেছিলাম। সো
না, এটা তো ইনফ্যাক্ট অনেক জিনিসই খুব ইন্টারেস্টিং, যেমন যেগুলো একটা হলো যে whether she knew Japanese at all or not, and I would imagine going by she would. What interested me was when they went off to when they returned to Japan. Women and Hariprabha returned, but Toshan didn't. Toshan opted to remain in India, and he was kind of interned as an enemy alien in Ajmer, and. It is not very clear whether Hariprabha took Japanese nationality under the Japanese nationality law of 1916, because foreign women were expected to abandon their nationality to take the Japanese one, if they got married to a Japanese. So even that is not very clear. But she did get documents and letter of permission to stay in Japan. And again,
it interests me very much that ওই এক্সপ্যাট্রিয়েশনটা ওরা এগ্রি করলো করে আর কি চলে গেল ওখানে
সেটাও when they returned, that was also, a lot of, because they had to get that official declaration by Osrubala. Osrubala was a doctor, and, her willingness to kind of accept the financial responsibility for the Takedas. So, about her nationality and how, she could go to Japan as the wife, but as a foreign wife, but without. So this is very interesting. This is not very clear. I could not make out.
তখনকার দিনে I somehow feel that in those days, ওই ন্যাশনালিটি চেঞ্জ করার ব্যাপারটা পর কি কিছু ছিল?
সেটা ছিল জাপানে 1916 এসে গেছিল জাপানিজ ন্যাশনালিটি ল। So but in 1916, the foreign women who married Japanese, the foreigners who married Japanese, they had to take the Japanese.
What I heard is that brother and his family, I wasn't able to get in touch with them, but they used to live in Jodhpur Park. The family, or whatever. They had, stayed on in India and they were here.
Yes.
Swapnadi is,
Swapna Banerjee, I think she was trying to ask something. Please go ahead.
So thank you, Sanjukta, for a very interesting talk. I particularly like the fact that you contextualized Hariprabha in the larger political culture of the time. And you also raised a very provocative point about whether her narrative could be considered as a migrant's tale versus a travelogue. So I'm so sorry to have missed Jayati's presentation. But I was wondering, Hariprabha was definitely drawing on others' narratives, because Japane Bongo Mohila and Krishna Bhabini Das's England Bongo Mohila, it resonates of Krishna Bhabini's title of a narrative, England Bongo Mohila. So there has to be some resonance of those kind of narratives in her writing, Hariprabha's writing. And if she were writing as a migrant's tale, she was also talking as an insider, because she was already part of a Japanese family that you have pointed out. So I was thinking, how would you place Hariprabha's narrative as neither a travelogue, but perhaps a migrant's tale in the context of other women who traveled and he wrote, and that, Jayati and Shimonti and so many other people have elaborately written upon. And you have actually written about, compared Hariprabha's with other women's narratives. So if you did not say anything about that here. So I'm trying to situate her both within the debate of public-private that you touched upon, and in the context of women's travel writings.
Thank you, Swapna, for a lovely question. And hello to Shimonti. And of course, I have to just start with this, that it is Shimonti's book, of course, which just inspired me with this, because I was teaching Shimonti's book, and, which got me to, especially one of her articles on Hariprabha, and then, which I used, and which got me to thinking about it. Now to come to your question, Swapna, about the migrant narrative. So, Hariprabha, the way I see it, like if we just look at Bangomila Japan Jatra by itself, we can call it a travel narrative. If we just like Bhaskar has done and etc. But when you take all the writings together, they are constant. They're not. They are what we would call back and forth. Migrants, circular migrants. So moving from one space and coming back to another, and returning and going back and returning. So in fact, we know of 3 trips that Hariprabha made to Japan. The second trip, she mentions it, that 1924 she went, but we don't know anything about it, nothing more. So it could also be possible that, for instance, when she's writing about those essays that she wrote on women's education in 1949. These were also perhaps Japanese Nari and Japanese Shontan Palono Nari Shikha. These were based also on the 1924 travels and the 1912 travels. So, these are the gaps which we don't know. I don't have certainly any information about. But when we look at it together, this is, in fact, I would say that this tells a story of migration. And this question of being the inside outsider, even the first narrative, she's getting a kind of a view if you compare it with Sorojinolini. I have not personally read Shanta Devi's but I think Jayati, you have mentioned that, you have discussed that in your book, have you? If I
Yes,
remember.
I have.
But when we look at Sorojinolini, there is a difference between Sorojinolini's and Hariprabha, because Hariprabha, where there is a part which is almost like an ethnographic description, where you can make it very clear that, okay, this is a different country, I have to acquaint people with the customs of that country. But then there is that thing about the family, her family members, the relationship with the family members, which is a very intimate history, the intimate history of family life. Sorojinolini also, and this is, again, Jayati would, Shimonti, Jayati, they will discuss this better than me. But what I have noticed that this whole question of education, this was perhaps the primary interest that all the traveling women had. So whether they are going to the west or to the east or anywhere, the question that they were looking at always was education. Ultimately, they would even, I was looking at some travel writings in Italy and the women. And then I see, ultimately, always the women are looking at the other women. The women are trying to understand the other women, situate them, see their education, see why they are same or, similarities and dissimilarities. And it's always through education, the filter of education. So Sorojinolini talks about education. Sorojinolini had that mission, in fact, to see for herself and to experience this education of modern Japan, which was, what for Hariprabha and Sorojinolini, this was the way forward for Bengali women. I would be tempted to know whether Sorojinolini read Hariprabha's travelogue before she embarked on her trip. And I would imagine yes, because Hariprabha's narrative was something that had excited a lot of interest. So I would imagine that Sorojinolini, who had resources at her disposal and was well educated, when she's embarking on Japan, she had possibly read Hariprabha's account. About Bongo Mohila Japan Jatri and the name, how much of this was, informed by travel writings, by previous travel writings, when there was a general interest in women travelers, and there was a general publication. So editors were also looking for women travelers. These travel accounts were being published, and there was a ready readership. There was this market. So, of course, they would inform one another, certainly. How much of this was personal choice? How much of these namings were editorial choice? Again, I don't know. But possibly in the case of Hariprabha, Bangamoliya Chapan Patra, this was published by Matri Niketan. So this was not really the editorial intervention. So it could have been a very clear decision to kind of situate herself in this genre of writing that had come up, the writings of the mother.
Yes, actually, Bhashwati, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I wanted to know, Sanjukta Di, the marriage was arranged by her father. Was there any, I mean to say that she will not be going to Japan permanently, and the person she is marrying, she will supposed to remain in India. The other way around. So that may be a precondition for her marriage, or that I mean, it's just
conjecture
because mostly the women they migrate to the in-laws place, in-laws countries, but in the this marriage that happened, it's unusual that Hariprabha's husband and he stayed in India and breathed last in India.
Not so unusual, because women Takeda had migrated in the first place in search of employment. Okay, and he had been their family from basically even in Japan. It was difficult for them to live on because they just did not have the means. Or when they went back in the 1940s, women was pretty old. They were not a young couple anymore. In a wartime situation, of course, jobs would be difficult, employment would be difficult, their family lacked the means. So I imagine that even earlier, it was not feasible for them to, especially when we read this initial statement that, when that where is it gone? Yes, Shoshur Bari. I wished I could stay on with her, but how is that possible? Now, she did not explain why it was not possible, and I should imagine that it was not simply financially possible for them to live on. And while women was there in Dhaka, they were not, I don't think he was a Bharjamai. So they were not, I doubt if they were breaking traditions quite so much. But their entire life work was associated with Matri Shodon and with Dhaka. That was the life that they had made for themselves.
Actually
being a
yes, Jayati, please.
Actually, being a Brahmo, when it was slightly different from this being a Jamai or this thing in a Hindu family. So that at that point of time, the Brahmo Samaj over there, that would be an interesting cultural background within which Hariprabha was brought up and, educated and that. So this idea that, we are looking at it from now and we're saying, তখনকার দিনে কি জাপানে কি করে বিয়ে করলো, or মানে that thing would not have happened, I think. Wouldn't be there.
Yes, we sometimes club women and make them much more as a category, much more homogeneous. Of course, there is a lot of world of difference between, say, a Hindu woman, an educated Hindu woman, upper caste Hindu woman, and say a lower caste woman, or Hindu and the Brahmo, a Christian woman and a Brahmo. So, there would be a lot of different fractures and a lot of different identities. We really can't club it as one. But yes, even by Brahmo standards, I would say that Hariprabha's family was very exceptional.
I was actually about to ask one thing, since I think someone mentioned Krishna Bhabini's England Bongo Mohila, and if you also think of, say, Pandita Ramabai's her travels to the United States, the people of the, I'm forgetting the title, the people of the United States, something like that it is. And of course, taking into account Hariprabha Takeda's experiences in Japan, would you say that, because this is something I certainly found in Krishna Bhabini and in Pandita Ramabai's travelogues, that it is the, it would be the differences that get foregrounded, difference between India and Japan, difference between India and England, and of course, the difference between India and the US?
In this case, I would say that, it is the difference. But when I see the differences, for example, differences within the family, differences, it is not as though, especially this is happening in Bangamuhilar Japan Jatra. She's talking about specificities. What makes Japan specific? And obviously when you're talking about specificities, it means that she's talking about a difference. But the tone is not of one who is talking about a difference, but they are different from us. No, it is of somebody who is remarking on a specific characteristic, but at the same time, a characteristic which India or Bengal will do well to learn from. So there is always that didactic thing in her, or and there is the only thing I think where Japan fell completely short of her expectations, both with her and with Sarojini was the food. They did not like the food, and that was absolutely clear. They absolutely did not like to Japanese food. But when I am looking at the narratives, and I'm locating it against the historical situations, both in Japan and in India, then I can see that, even when she's looking at the differences, when she's remarking on the specificities, she's remarking on certain issues which are being discussed simultaneously in both the countries. So the milieu, the cultural milieu, the output is different, the result is different, but the debates are there in both the cultures at the same time. And it is only when she rarely criticizes. The food she criticized, but otherwise, this is again interesting that she did not really criticize ever in the Bangamuhilar Japan Jatra anything to do with, you would never, just reading it, you would not get that criticism, that there is any implicit criticism in the way, say, the Japanese people look at the emperor as their god. But in Juthe Charcharita Japan, it is there. It is not very strongly articulated, but you could see that criticism there all the time. That the emperor, these Japanese, they believe the emperor to be God. How can I make them understand the emperor is not God? So, there you see that her political views are much more open, though again understated. There is never any over. This is again another thing which I find very fascinating about her and her personality, is that she does not make that forceful remark. She does not make that articulating, this is what I think. No, it's always understated.
Right. So I guess we come to the end of the program. Is it so, Bhashwati or Purna? Any other question or comments? You have to unmute yourself, Bhashwati.
I was just thinking if there is any more questions.
Right.
So we have with us Shimonti Di, Madhurima, Shomita Di, Professor Zareen Alam. Please, আপনারা কিছু বলবেন?
I think Shomita Di has left.
Shomita Di has left, no?
Yeah.
Okay.
She was has left.
I haven't left. I'm here.
Nah,
Oh,
Shomita
sorry.
is.
Oh my God.
No, no. Please, Shomita di, কিছু বলবেন?
You entered with another identity, so.
No, no. Professor Shomita di.
Hi.
সীমান্তি ভয় পেয়ে চলে গেল। So my question, Sanjukta, I had two questions. One is the question of motherhood. So you spoke about motherhood. It's also, motherhood comes in a very different context in the way Matriniketan and the relationship with Matriniketan. But you didn't speak of her children. Did she have any?
She didn't have, she was childless. She didn't have any
Right.
children.
So how does that inflect the whole issue of motherhood for her? So that was one question. The second question, totally unrelated to the first question, is the issue of, so this is the time when also there is experimentation, but the Pan-Asianism is a big ideology. And this whole sort of spirituality of the East, connections between the East, all this, you mentioned Buddhism is aspect, but there is a broader understanding of an East versus West civilizational difference. How does that, or did that at all play into this kind of the Hariprabha's own writings, or in terms of how this marriage was framed, or the relationships?
Thank you, Shomita. That was, of course, lovely questions, as would be expected. And thanks for the questions. No, I actually skipped over that part because it was already getting very late. But I have discussed this at length, really, where now Hariprabha, so far as I remember, Bangamohila Japan Jatra does not dwell upon this at great length. It's not as though she is talking about it, but we can see that, I am going to make that assumption, that Shoshi Bhushan and, that entire ambience, that Brahmo family, etc., that they were a part of this, they did participate in this wider idea of the morality of the East, and the cultural unity of Asian countries, the moral superiority of Asia, over the colonizing forces of Europe, and so, which is something that was kind of leading to the refashioning of the colonial self. So, there is, when we look at Bangamohila Japan Jatra, there is that, again, this is to go to the question, I think Dr. Parna, was it Parna Ghose who asked me, anyway, about the difference. And this is where, as I was saying, that difference is never very strongly or very clearly articulated. I think it is because also there was that participation in that East and West. So when we are talking about the inside-outsider, it is not simply the inside-outsider of the Bengali and the married into a Japanese household, but a greater unity of Asians who might be different, but who are insiders as well. So again, Hariprabha's this cultural milieu, and I talked about it. This is something that they participated in, and this is what I have argued. But was there any very explicit assertion of this? No, it wasn't. But I think it is palpable in the way she looks at Japan, where Japan is never very visibly the other. It is the other, but it is also part of a greater cultural unity. There is that similarity. And for instance, when she's talking about the Japanese temples, etc., the customs, taking off your shoes to enter the house, and these are customs with which one could immediately identify with. So at the level of the journal, there are these kind of indications which showed that this, this participation within this larger cultural world. But of course, and also, I would say, yes. Now, this whole idea of the so in the first half of the 20th century, especially when she made her first trip, the overwhelming idea was of Pan-Asianism, and the idea of this greater India would then come later from the 1930s. But that you don't find that greater India, of course, in Japan, but Pan-Asianism certainly. Now,
can I interrupt and prompt you with something, Sanjukta?
Yes.
Which is within a Brahmo milieu. Is there a participation? So I'm following now from Tagore, and the conversation between Brahmoism and Buddhism. Does that have any relevance?
This is, I think, an area where I would have to look into. But perhaps there would be, when you're talking about Buddhism. Now, I don't remember the Wangamohilar, the entries so clearly, but rather than Brahmoism, I think this idea of Buddhism as something Indian. When Hariprabha writes about it, she does not bring in Brahmoism as such, but she talks about this cultural link between India and Japan. Through like Buddhism is something that connects India and China, Japan, and of course China. That's another question. But whether Hariprabha herself does not remark upon it. Again, so, when we come to it, this is a conjecture which I will then have to look into further. And to come to your first question on motherhood, and, when they are childless, how then, how are they then looking at the question of motherhood, I would argue, first of all, when they went to Japan, when she's writing Wangamohila Japan Jatra, she was still very young. You should imagine 25. When it came out, she was 25 years old. Plenty of time for her to be a mother, or not to give up on motherhood altogether, but which is neither here or there. But motherhood and Matriniketan, this brings us to this question that do you have to be a mother to actually, look at or to understand motherhood, to imagine, and again, her views on motherhood, where she talks about it. She's talking about how Japanese mothers organize their family life and their children's welfare better than Bengali mothers. And so in this, again, we have this Hariprabha in the role of a kind of a teacher, the role of the supervisor of Matriniketan, looking after her inmates, looking after, the Matriniketan had many trafficked girls. They also had, it was a place also for pregnant women. So motherhood is something that, again, I don't know about her sisters, whether they were married or whether they had children or not. Of course, Osrubala did, but at the time of writing, whether they had children, I cannot tell. I'm not very certain. But I think this whole question of motherhood came up as part of her response to the women's question, when she's looking at the women, and the roles of the women are the mother, the women in the family, the educator, women as educators. So this is how she really responds to the question.
Okay, I think anyone else? It's pretty late over here. It's almost 10:30 now, 10:20, 10:30. So I would thank both Professor Jayati Gupta and Professor Sanjukta Dasgupta for two absolutely brilliant talks. We all have been enlightened, enriched by these talks, and I would request the organizers to henceforth in the future to please organize